Welcome to tonight's Autonomy Live event. This is a Wednesday night. This is September 25th, 2019. Tonight's guest speaker is G. Edward Griffin, who is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. He's also made quite a few videos, documentary films over the years. We're going to talk about some of those in a little bit. First, Ed, welcome tonight. The floor is yours. We have some questions, but also consider it a zone where you can have parrhesia, speak freely, openly, because we're all pretty familiar with your work and have a high degree of respect for it.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I'm really delighted to be here because as I mentioned to you the other day, I really am quite impressed by what you've got started here. So I want to help in any way I can. Not that you need any help at all, but let me turn that around. I want to tag along. Let's put it that way, and see where it heads, because I like your idea of jumping in and then figuring out which way to swim, because I do that all the time. If I wait until I get it all figured out, I'll never get started. Quite often, I just jump in and start splashing around on a project. I've been doing that, as a matter of fact, for the last 3 days, trying to get our website up for the Red Pill Expo coming up in November. I took it on myself. I said, I'm going to learn how to do all this darn techie stuff. I'm going to get this website up. I'm going to do it. I don't want to have to be dependent upon some techie again, because I work like 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, and you just can't call somebody and say, hey, Harold, how do you do that again? You have to know these things if you want to push through and meet deadlines. Unless you've got a big pot full of money, you can hire teams of people all around the world, call them up in Australia or China or someplace, and yeah, they're ready to go. But anyway, the point is that I've been pushing through, not knowing what the heck I'm doing, but figuring out as I go. And I see that quality here and what you're doing. To me, I think it's one of the most important models to learning is not be afraid to start, even though you don't have any idea how in heck it's going to work out. 99.9% of the time, it does work out, and it turns out to be the best way to learn. It's just force yourself to get bruised and cut and bleed, and then you patch up, and that's how it works. So anyway, I took too long to say that, I admire what you're doing, and I just glad to be a part of it. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, I think the reason that 99.9% of the time that it works out, that's a result of your persistence and the hardiness with which you approach your work. You're willing to go out and do these things and throw yourself in a little confusion. And of course, we call it triggering complexity. It's willfully doing something that's breaking your comfort zone so that you can grow, so you can find your limits, and eventually with some learning and falling down and getting up, you can exceed those limits, and that's what growth comes from. And so it's exciting that that's why I think that your mind is still so young, because you continue to challenge it. You continue to do things that I don't know how this is going to happen, but it needs to be done. So we're going to start on it. And the example of you trying to do your own website for the Red Pill Expo, which is going to be in November, we can talk about that later. And the fact that you're doing that website, because I think we can help you get that all together a lot smoother, because that's part of what we teach in the courses, personal media platform and how to have some control over it so you know how it works. And then, of course, if you want to delegate it later, you still know how it works.
Right. It's very, very important. When that 2 o'clock crisis comes, 2 o'clock in the morning, you have to be able to jump in and get the wrench and start, oiling the gears and turning the wrench and fix it right there on the spot. Otherwise, you're just not going to get anywhere.
Well, I know that there's many students here tonight who have you to thank for all the wonderful experiences they had at this year's Red Pill that was here in Hartford. There's like 36 autonomy graduates that attended, and they had such a splendid time at your gathering, and you were such a wonderful host, and the VIP dinner was so classy, and Del Bigtree's speech, getting that award, the NEO award, right?
Yes.
And that was an amazing life experience, and we all treasured it. And to know that there's another one coming up in November, that's news to me as of a couple days ago. I thought the next one was going to be next year. So go ahead and let us know, just so people can put it on their radar, maybe put it on their calendar. Where's it going to be, and when is it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's November 8 and 9, and it's in Mesquite, Nevada. Yes, Mesquite. Don't forget that name. Mesquite is north of Las Vegas. It's about a 45, 50-minute drive. So it's out there, you get into some pretty country. It's not quite the desert it is around Las Vegas. But the first question is, why are we going into Mesquite and not in Las Vegas? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The main one being we don't like Las Vegas too much. It's kind of everything we detest. It's artificial. It's phony. It's expensive. It's glitter. It's not real. There's all illusion there. It's all illusion. And it's, of course, now one of the main topics at the next event is going to be the 5G problem, health problems from 5G radiation. And if you can imagine the kind of electromagnetic pollution that exists in Las Vegas, and think of what that is doing to your genetic structure, to your DNA, and we'll be talking about that at the conference, some medical studies on how this hidden toxic stuff called EMF is literally changing our DNA and throwing us into a tailspin as a species, by the way, not just as individuals, but it's changing our ability to procreate healthy. And it's forcing us into a position where our grandchildren and great-grandchildren maybe someday won't even be able to procreate at all. So this is serious stuff, and we want to get it. If we're going to talk about that, we certainly don't want to hold this thing in Las Vegas, where it's the thickest toxic electromagnetic soup you could possibly imagine. But the other reason is that it's pretty out there. The cost is very low. We're holding it at the Rising Star Sports, what they call the sports resort. It is a resort. It's across the road from a real resort. I think it's the only resort casino resort in that town. And so they're owned, I think, commonly. But where we're at, the Rising Star, it's what they call the sports specialty. They have baseball diamond there and basketball stuff. And it's a place where young people go and teams, and they have events and that kind of thing. Really clean. It's pleasant. And it's very inexpensive. So we're able to get meals and accommodations a lot cheaper than we would in the big city. So we pass that along to the people who are coming to the event in the form of lower ticket prices. Of course, they'll have to rent a car and get from Las Vegas out to Mesquite or take a shuttle. But that's not too expensive nowadays. Our town is loaded with rental cars, and for $100 to $120, you're covered for the weekend. So that's where it is, and it's a regular Red Pill Expo meeting. We started off with the idea that we would have kind of a replay of what we did previously, where every other 6 months we would have a smaller event, an event that was, so far in the past, we'd always focused on one issue. And the last one we had, for example, was on the global warming myth. And we did that. It was a very successful thing. And we're going to do it again this year on 5G. But as we talked about it, there were so many other things that had to be mentioned. One of the themes that we'll be talking about coming up in November is the connection that most people are not aware of between antidepressant drugs and mass shootings. Everybody's saying, take away those guns. They're the problem. The guns are causing these mass shootings. No, the guns are not. It's these SSRI drugs. I'm going to say practically every one of those shooters, the press doesn't play this up very much. If you look into the news reports, you'll find they're all on anxiety or reducing or antidepressant drugs. If you look at those drugs, and we'll have some technical people, medical people that are talking about the side effects of those drugs, read those little slips, those warning slips come with the drugs themselves. Nobody does that. They warn against homicidal instincts and impulses and suicidal impulses. And that's right there in the label. And nobody say, it's on the labels, but no, it couldn't be bad, or they wouldn't market the drugs, So anyway, we'll be talking about the connection between these antidepressant drugs and these mass shootings. That's what we don't need gun control. We need drug control in order to get rid of these shootings. So that'll be another topic. We thought, how can we do that if we're just going to talk about 5G and we have some other topics too? So we kicked it around and around and around. We said, okay, look, we've got a winner. Everybody wants to come to the Red Pill Expo. It's a good brand. Everybody knows what it means, break the illusion, face reality. look at life the way it really is, man. So why don't we just stick with that? And we kicked it around and said, okay, let's do it. We made a decision. We jumped in the water. We said, okay, well, now we're swimming toward another Red Pill Expo. And that decision was made about 2 weeks ago.
I like how you move fast. Some people would need a year or 2 years to set up something. You're like, we're going to do it in November. You started it 2 weeks ago. You'll figure out how to go forward. You're figuring out how to build the site and all that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
So kudos to you. Here's Hank, a little golf clap, but you should also get some help with that. And I think that after we talk through especially the last questions that I have lined up, there's going to be some people who might be interested in helping you get there sooner than later. And I think that could really work out well. And the other thing I wanted to applaud is having it in or like near Las Vegas is good for travel wise to get to Las Vegas. It's easy. But having it outside, that's beautiful, because trying to have it in Las Vegas would be trying to study silence in the middle of Times Square. It's not the appropriate venue.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, and the cost of the airfare into Las Vegas from almost any place in the world is so much cheaper that more than pays for the cost of rental of a car to get from Vegas out to Mesquite. So those were all of the considerations we made. But anyway, we're looking forward to it. And, our first Red Pill Expo was in Bozeman, Montana. Now, there's another one. Bozeman, people said, where's Bozeman? Some people didn't even know where Montana was. But it was a smashing success. People came from all around the world. A lot of people wanted to see Montana, never had an excuse to go there before. This was their excuse. And so I think it's going to be the same thing. There's some great national parks around the Mesquite area. You get up in the higher elevations. There's some beautiful forests and water running down over the cliffs. It's just like getting up into the Sierra Nevadas. So it's an interesting country.
I think it's an important part of the event that people don't often consider. If you find some friends that can go with you, you've got carpooling, you got life memories. That's an excursion. It's an expedition. It's an adventure that you can have couple times a year for various events, and you should have the resources to be able to go and say yes to those things you want to do, and to be able to say no to some of the things you don't want to do. So I applaud you for taking on and focusing on some of these topics. They do need focus, especially the over pharmaceutical prescriptions of young people, in lieu of teaching them how to use their brains, how to actually function and balance their emotions, how to psychologically drive their actions in a meaningful way. But they're being trained to be automatons. And on top of that, they're being blocked from their goals, which makes them frustrated, aggressive, and either sets them up for pharmaceutical drugs or prison. That's the two options that are being offered through the majority of the systems that are created. That's the purpose of those systems, to feed on those kids.
Right. Well, those are the things we'll be talking about. And it's interesting to me, Richard, that once we got this idea of talking about illusion versus reality and got rid of all of the old ways of describing things, like our patriotic responsibility, study the Constitution and worry about attack from foreign ideologies and all these things, which are very real, very important, and they're core issues. But it's kind of ho hum to a lot of people. If you don't understand it to start off with, it doesn't sound like it's real. So it was always hard. It always has been hard to interest people in learning about the issues that are the most important issues of their lives, using the old descriptions, find out what's happening to the Constitution. Did you know that the Second Amendment is being violated? And they'll say, the Second Amendment of what? What is that? And so when we started using the red pill meme, it just was like it was a click. And I can tell you that one of the most pleasant experiences I've ever had is this ride since 2016, 17, when no matter who I talk to about the Red Pill Expo, you can see their eyes light up. Oh, what is that? Red pill, huh? What? It's and they'll call me and say, what was that again? And when is it going to be held? And what are you going to be talking about? And it's just like, why didn't we think of this 20 years ago? So we're lucky we thought of it when we did, and we're going to try and just do what we can with it. I think it's a way that we're going to reach millions and millions of people.
All right. So now that we know where you are today, where you're going to be in November, a lot of us are interested in how you got to be where you are today. So I want to take you back in time a little bit, just a gentle time machine ride. Can you tell us where young George Edward Griffin was born, and what city, what year, and what were times like back then?
I'll have to rewind a lot of tape to get back to 1931 in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit was sure a different town then than it is now. Of course, it was the mecca for the automobile industry. Even in 1931, they were building a lot of automobiles in Detroit already. But by the time the World War II was over in 1940, 41, getting to 45, all the factories were being expanded, and millions of people were dependent on the automobile industry. There was a lot of money in the town. It was culturally mixed, racially mixed. It was a lot of mixed economics. I mean, there were rich and poor. There were academics, and there were athletes. I mean, there were different religions, as I said, and it was a tremendous melting pot. And there were some minor conflicts that come in any major city where you have, groups of diverse characteristics, but very few. I don't remember anything serious at all. There was a race riot that happened. I've forgotten the exact year, and that was we knew in Detroit that there were very few people involved. It was just a small group. But by the time the media got through with it, television already was in place at that time. And the television coverage of it showed these few blocks where buildings were burning, and they showed the same blocks from different angles. It looked like the whole city was on fire. And it was the first time I became aware at a very young age of the theater aspect of the media, and how the media was being used to create false impressions of reality, or to distort reality. But the main point here, I'll come back perhaps to that theater thing, because it is very important. But back in Detroit in those days, we had, it was comfortable. I enjoyed being raised there. I never had to worry about what part of town I went into. The school I went to in Redford was an all-white school. It just happened to be where it was. I personally lived about 6 miles away from there. I had to take the bus to get to high school, but where I lived was Livernois and 8 Mile, and we were right at the 2 blocks at the edge. There was sort of not a real dividing line, but we knew that after 2 blocks over, well, it was pretty much black. That's where all the black people were living, and we were friends. We went to the same grade school. There was no problem. But then there was black town, there was the white town. It was none of this animosity, none of this hatred, none of this conflict. And so Detroit was a different town then. And of course, I was, as I said, I lived over on Livernois and 8 Mile, which today you would probably need an armored car to go over there. I've often wanted to go back and visit the house that I was raised in, if I could. Maybe it's not even there. But I was raised by an old maid school teacher aunt and my grandmother. I came from a broken home. My parents, bless them, I really don't have much of a memory of them, but I do remember that they drank a lot. And the reason I was taken in by my aunt and my grandmother was because I didn't have a home. I mean, we really lived in what you would call the slums. I didn't know it. I didn't know what slums meant. I did know that I didn't like sleeping on a bare mattress that had the terrible smell of urine and stains. And I know I didn't like seeing cockroaches and rats running around, but I didn't know that was unacceptable. I thought that was just the way life was as a little kid. Now, of course, if anybody, you talk about that, they oh heavens, I was raised in a terrible environment. Well, I guess it's true. well, I have to say I'm lucky because I was pulled out of there by my aunt and my grandmother. And my aunt was a school teacher. So now at about the age of, I guess it was 9, I got transplanted from from the east side of Detroit down near Belle Isle, which was an island in the middle of the Detroit River. And I got picked up and moved and dropped into over on the other side of town. And for the first time, I started to go to school because prior to that, I was a dropout. I didn't go to school. In fact, I hated school, mainly because I wasn't doing well. And I wasn't doing well because I skipped school. And then I'd come back and try and go to school. But since I was already 6 or 7 lessons behind, I couldn't answer any of the questions. And everybody would laugh at me. And so I didn't go to school the next day. And I was in one of those vicious cycles. And I was really heading out in a bad direction. But when I got transplanted over to Louis Pasteur School, I had kind of a fresh start. And I fortunately had some really good teachers. I'll tell you, since you asked me, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to wander through some of the things that I remember. In those days in this school, there was a class they called, of all things, auditorium. That was the name of the class, auditorium. Well, we had a little auditorium in the school, and the whole purpose of the class was to introduce the kids to communication skills, getting up in front of a group of people and talking or playing a musical instrument or acting, or they put on little plays, how you do something in front of others in sort of a formal environment. And I guess I just thought, oh, this is cool. I like this. I wouldn't dream of skipping that class. I could look forward to going to it. And I remember, I think it was the first day in that class. Remember, I'm just a little kid, about 9 or 10 years old. And they asked if anybody could play the piano. They had one of these little upright pianos there in the front of the class at the stage. And nobody could play the piano. Well, I could play the piano. I could play chopsticks. I've learned how to play chopsticks on my aunt's piano. Bum, 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 bum. That was a terrible thing. But everybody with a piano in their house could play chopsticks. So I said, I can play the piano. So I played chopsticks. And when I was all done, for the first time in my life, I heard this sound for me. I thought, oh, I'm really worth something. I have value. People like me. I did something that was good. And it was at that precise point, Miss Schweitzer was her name, the teacher of that class, had a profound effect on the direction of my life because of that little experience of asking me to play chopsticks and having the positive feedback from my classmates. It just made me feel like, hey, this is something I should be doing. I should be excelling. I should be doing something that's not easy. Playing chopsticks for me was not easy. I really hammered away to learn how to do that. So, and then of course, we had the Christmas play, and I was in the play as a shepherd, and I had a few lines to speak, and the parents came in, they sat in the audience, and I heard this sound again. I thought, man, this is for me. So then we had a speech contest. The Daughters of the American Revolution sponsored an annual patriotic speech contest in some aspect of American history, and or world history in this case, because the topic that year was South America. And so I prepared a speech on South America. I don't know what I said about South America. I guess I got some books or asked around, what do you say about South America? All I remember is that I learned I remembered the 11 countries of South America, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, and so forth. That was a major accomplishment, to remember all these countries of South America. And I won first prize. Well, this was cool. So now I'm in the speech-making business. And, okay, that's how I got started, is in this little, I started to say crummy. That would be wrong, because it was really a nice little grade school. And then I went to intermediate school, and I had another teacher, another woman that greatly impacted my life, Miss Stevens. Miss Stevens had a speech class and a radio class, speech and radio combined. And she taught kids who wanted to learn how to give speeches and how to act in radio programs. Well, I'm all over that. So I learned how to read a script, and we all stand up at a fake microphone and we read these silly scripts. And I was good at it. I was about as good. I was better than most. So again, I'm hearing this sound. I'm thinking, I'm onto something here. This is better than skipping school and having everybody laugh at me, you know? So I decided that maybe I should try. I should actually start now to try to do things and achieve in things, because the rewards were good, made me feel good about myself. So Miss Stevens asked me if I would like to sign up for a speech contest that was sponsored by the Hearst newspapers, an oratorical contest, annual. It was a patriotic one, and the one that year was on the topic of Patrick Henry. I said, yeah, count me in. So I read up on Patrick Henry, and I think it was a 3-minute speech, it's something like that. And all the kids write their scripts, they read it, and they memorize it, and they deliver it from memory. It was not one of these extemporaneous things. So I wrote a good speech on Patrick Henry. I quoted him, the usual lines, give me liberty and give me death and all that sort of thing. It was then that I got a little inkling of some of the fervor of the American Revolution, indirectly because I was doing the speech contest. And blow me down, Richard, I won for the school. And then I went on to the school district, and I won in the school district. And then I went on to the county level, and I won for the county level. And I went on to the state level, and I won for the state level. And then they put me on a train and took me to Washington, D.C., where there was the national level from all over the country, of all the winners of all the states. And I was the winner for the whole bloody country. I was the national oratorical champion, Believe it or not, my headline and a picture of me was on the front page of the Detroit Free Press, I guess it was, one of the Detroit newspaper. It was, in those days they had different editions, one that came out early in the morning, one that came out in the afternoon. So there was a slow news day. So I was in the early morning one. I wasn't in the afternoon one, but I've got a copy of it, one of my prize things in my drawer, of the headline, local boy wins national oratorical contest. And there's my mug on the picture. So now I'm really thinking I'm on a roll. I'm going to really go into this thing called communications and speech making and so forth. So that's how it all started. Just one little thing led to another. They had a class that the Detroit schools put on a Saturday. It was an elective thing. And they would really teach kids how to do radio acting. And they held the class at a radio station that was run by the Detroit public school system. It was a real radio program, but it was run by the school system. So if you wanted to go down to the studios and learn how to perform or act or speak on radio, this is where you went. So I signed up for that. And we had to take a couple of buses to get across town, get there at 9:30 in the morning on Saturday. Boy, when I got there, Richard, I think there must have been a couple hundred kids there at least. And it was a room not that big, but anyway, the Studio A was their big studio where it was big enough to put an orchestra in over in one corner and a couple of actors and a sound truck and, things like that. It was a pretty good room. It was packed and there weren't enough chairs. And I remember I was standing and sitting on the floor in the back and all these kids in front of me. And up in front, way up in there in front, there was somebody talking about, this is a microphone, that's the control room, and you see the director in there. He'll throw a cue at you, and that means you start speaking. And if he wants you to speak faster, he'll do this. If he wants you to slow down, he'll do this. And and this is how we make sound effects. All of this was going on. I thought this was wonderful. And remember, this is the heyday of radio, and so that was like everything. So I was all in for that, and I came back the following Saturday. And fortunately, by this time, a lot of the kids didn't come. About half of them came back. So I got a chair this time. And the next Saturday, I came back, and half of those had gone. And the next Saturday, half of those were gone. And after about 8 or 9 weeks of that, there were about 8 of us left. And we were the ones that really were serious about this, and we just threw ourselves into it. And whenever any of the radio stations in Detroit needed child actors, this was the group they came to. So I got to be, as a child actor, I got to be at the Lone Ranger program, came out of WXYZ in Detroit. I had my own Saturday morning Make Way for Youth program that was broadcast over CBS. Actually, a whole national thing came out of Detroit. Don Large in the youth chorus, and I was the MC. Let's see what else. So we did. Every Saturday morning, Detroit had its version of Let's Pretend. Let's Pretend came out of Chicago. That was the big Saturday child story. And Detroit, we had our own. I think it was called. It wasn't as good as Let's Pretend. Anyway, I think it was just like story time. It was called story time. And this was done in front of an audience. Can you believe, back in the days, the heyday of radio, they actually did radio programs in front of live audiences. And the actors were up on the stage, and they had the spotlights and the director up there and the sound truck. And it was a big deal. And people in the audience, and they get the cues to applaud and all that sort of thing. And all those Saturday morning shows had an audience of maybe 200 or 300 kids that would get bussed in to see the local production of Storytime. So that's how I got into all of this. I just sort of one step to another. So, and I came from a position where I was skipping school and really on a dead end track. I was probably going to wind up in a very bad situation. So because I had a couple of good teachers, and I was very fortunate to have an aunt and a grandmother that took me in and brought me into a new environment, I was lucky as all get out. I was able to see a better way, and I was able to discover things inside me that I didn't know were in there. I was able to picture myself as being worthy and being able to accomplish something. And it wasn't until many years later that I discovered that I had a crusader gene. But in those days, I was just, a little kid, discovering himself, discovering things that were exciting and fulfilling and making life worthwhile. So you asked me all this. I'm taking too long. I'll skip through the rest of it very quickly. I went to the University of Michigan and majored in speech and communications. I worked my way through college with 2 jobs. I bussed tables in a sorority house. And then every day after school, I would work at the local radio station, WUOM, and was an announcer there. And so when I came out of school, I got married a few days after graduation, married my wife, Pat. I mean, why not? She was the prettiest nurse on campus. That's what you have to do. And they find the prettiest girl on campus and you marry them. It's in the book somewhere. And I did that. And then I went to work in Detroit in WWJ TV as my official title was assistant TV director, but that was a highfalutin title. All I was a floor manager. I've got some pictures someday. I'll show them to you. But there I am in the studio throwing cues from the floor to some guy. He's 2 feet away from me, and he's a stagehand. And he's putting a card up on a music stand, typing big print on the card, and the camera would come in and take a picture of the card because they didn't have ways to electronically inject text in those days. If you wanted to put print on television, you print it on a card, put the card on a stand, put a light on it, and put the camera on it. And then somebody like me has to stand there and throw a cue. So I did that sort of thing. And then went into the military. I got involved with USO tours because I wound up helping a colonel who was in charge of the service clubs on the base at Fort Leonard Wood in Texas. And I was actually there I was in the Army, and I was in the division where we were. I'm drawing a blank. Artillery. Thank you, Edward. Artillery. But I was in the radar session because I had hung around in all these radio and television stations, and I had picked up the jargon from the engineers, and I knew words like ohm and resistance and potentiometers and things like that. So I scored, I guess, pretty high on the aptitude test. So they put me into radar school as maintenance guy. They taught me how to repair and maintain radar systems, which really I was very fortunate, because it was an experience that I didn't know I had an interest in. I didn't know I had a technical side of me until then. I thought, hey, this is really cool. I wanted to learn about electronics and how electrons move and all that sort of thing. So I got through school, and all of my buddies were being transferred up to the dew line in Alaska. That was the dew line, they called it, where a bunch of radar systems were up there to monitor the horizon against incoming Russian missiles, supposedly Soviet missiles. And it was really a lousy duty. But if you ever seen pictures of the barracks up there, it's about as bleak as you can imagine. And that's where we were all headed. But I ran into this colonel in the PX, and he knew me from, and I knew him from Detroit when I was in the television station. He was an agent in those days. He bringing actors in for various programs, and we got to be friendly. And but now I meet him again at Fort Leonard Wood, and he's a colonel, and I'm an enlisted man. I'm a corporal at this point. So after the salute, we say, "Hey, how you doing?" And so we had coffee, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, They made me an instructor." I forgot to say that. All my other guys went up the dew line, and they held me back and made me an instructor. So I thought, wow, I must have done something good, because I did not want to go to the dew line. So I was an instructor for about 3 weeks, and then I met this guy, and he says, "I need you." He said, "I'm in charge of all the service clubs on the base." And he says, "I don't really know anything about that." He said, "I'm an agent. I don't know anything about entertainment or microphones and all that stuff." He said, "I think I can get you transferred over to help me. Are you interested?" I said, "Am I? Of course." So a week later, I'm now sitting behind a desk and helping this guy run the service clubs. What a cushy job, This is how I fought the war. And then another week or two later, he gets transferred out. I guess they put him in the swamps in Louisiana, some kind of a training battalion. So there I am with some very uninformed lieutenant filling the spot. He didn't know anything at all. He just depended on me to do everything. So I literally became the guy in charge of the service clubs at Fort Leonard Wood very quickly. And that's how I finished out the years there. And then during that time, I met Raymond Burr, who came through on a USO trip. And it was my job to put on the performances. We put up the stage, and we got the bleachers and the microphone, the lights, and all the props and everything. And so I got to know Raymond Burr in a couple of days where we worked and rehearsed on this. And after the show was all done, I took him back to his hotel in town. He said, "Well, come on in, I'll buy you a drink." "Oh, yeah, fine, thank you." So we're sitting there having a couple of drinks, and Burr turns to me and says, "What are you going to do when you get out of this man's army?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I'll probably go back to Detroit and pick up where I left off." He says, "Oh, you don't want to do that. Come on out to Hollywood. I'll fix you up. I'll show you, introduce you to some big people, this kind of thing." "Oh, that's great." I took his card. I'm in. So when I was discharged, I went to Hollywood and I looked him up. I called him up. And he answered the phone. He said, "Hey, Ray, this is Ed Griffin." A long pause. He said, "Who?" I said, "Ed Griffin. Remember the USO tour at Fort Leonard Wood in Texas?" Long pause. Oh, yeah. How's it going?" I said, "Well, that's going good. Remember, you invited me here when I got out of the service. You said you introduced me to some people." Yeah. Yeah, okay. He didn't remember me. He had no more interest in helping. I had lunch with him that day. And anyway, he says, "Well, let's stay in touch." So by this time, I'm in Hollywood, okay? And that was the last time I saw Raymond Burr. And so I started looking for work in Hollywood. And I'll cut this now finally to the chase, because we're very close now to where it gets meaningful in terms of what I'm doing now. I decided after probably 6 months or so that there were a lot of people in Hollywood with much greater talent than mine who were bussing tables, bussing dishes, and pumping gasoline, washing cars, waiting for their big chance in Hollywood. And I could see that they were going nowhere. And there were many, many, many of them. And I could see, well, this is not going to work for me. By this time, I'm married. I have a kid and another one in the hatch. I'm thinking I better get serious about life, and I've got to protect and take care of these beautiful people that I'm responsible for. And that's when, you never, as a man, a young man, I don't think you really get serious about life until you wake up some morning and you look and you've got a woman and a child or more, and you think, my God, I'm responsible for this. I can't just play anymore. This is different. And something happens, and I think it happens to not everybody, but most of the guys I know. When they start looking at those kids and they realize that they created that and they've assumed a responsibility, they change. They become, I'll use the word men. Not that they weren't men before, but they have a suddenly they're no longer children in attitude. So that happened to me. So I got a real job for an insurance company. I went to work in the health insurance department, group insurance department for a large insurance company, the Equitable Life Assurance Society. And I was involved with underwriting and creating policies and helping the salesmen in the field deliver these policies to their clients. And I was doing well. I had figured out that this was where I was going to spend my life, climbing the corporate ladder. And I picked the Equitable quite carefully because I looked at the men in the key executive positions in the company, and they were really old. And I looked at the next level, and there was a big hole. Then the young guys, and I could see something was going to happen. When these older guys retired, there was going to be a vacuum. And the people at the lower levels of management were going to be pulled up because of just lack of personnel. I thought, this is where I want to be when that big vacuum starts. I want to be there. So I was doing my best to climb the ladder. I'm doing everything correctly. I put in extra time. I did the job well, and I was going places. I had become assistant divisional group manager after 2 years, and it looked like, if I just kept my nose clean, I would probably be a vice president and live in a penthouse in New York or something like that, maybe 10 or 12 years or 15 years. And that's where I was going and now we come to the turn in the road. Until I read a pamphlet. And the pamphlet was written by some college professor in a small Midwestern town. And he said some very harsh things about the United Nations. He said that it was a scam, that it was a plan for a global dictatorship, pretending to be concerned about the well-being of human beings and pretending to be building a world of harmony and peace and brotherhood, but when in reality, they were building a world totalitarian system. I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard, because I came out of the University of Michigan. I had been taught that the United Nations was our last best hope for peace. And I really believed it then, as many people still do. And so I didn't, I thought this is absurd, but it gnawed at me because the evidence he presented was rather convincing. I couldn't argue with the evidence. I just had to argue with the conclusion of the evidence. I thought there's something wrong about the evidence. So I did something I never thought I would do again, Richard. I went to the library. Our offices were in downtown Los Angeles, and there's a big library about 3 blocks away from there. I walked by it many times. This time I didn't walk by it. One day I was on lunch break and I walked into the library. I went into the International Affairs Division, and I looked at all the books on the United Nations. I checked some of them out. And as I read them, they were all written by people who were on the payroll of the UN in some way or another. They all were dependent upon being friends of the UN. And so I got the smell of bias very strong. And I became very critical of what I was reading. And the more I read, the more the books written by these people themselves convinced me that this college professor was right. Well, I was incensed at this. And this is when I discovered my crusader gene started to vibrate. I thought, I can't let this go. I've got to do something about this. So I started giving presentations on it. Okay, this is what I'm trained to do, right? Put me in, coach. I can give a speech. So I started giving presentations and I offered my services to Kiwanis clubs and things like that. I put on little presentations on the third floor of the insurance company building every Thursday night, where I showed a film strip and would talk about that. And we'd get anywhere from 6 to 12 to 15 people there every Thursday. And so the word got out that I was a free speaker and had something to say. First thing you know, I'm getting engagements to give speeches. And that's when I decided, as I then began to learn that the myth of the United Nations is a common myth. Everywhere I looked, I found similar illusions, similar lies, similar deceptions. And I became on fire with this drive to have to do something about it. So I quit my job. I decided I'm going to become a crusader. I quit my job at the Equitable. My poor wife, I thought she was going to have a fit. She said, what are we going to do? And I don't know. We're talking about jumping in and swimming and not knowing which way you're going. I really jumped big. I jumped off the high board and I didn't know what was down there at all. I quit my job because I had to break free and start doing something, I don't know what, to get the word out. So that's when the big break was made, and I decided to sink or swim. I started to produce little low-budget documentaries, 16-millimeter films. Primarily, they were my presentations. Some of them are still on the internet, by the way. People can go to our website and look at them, and you'll see me with a little narrow tie, just like everybody was in those days. My insurance costume was on, nice sort of a glossy, shiny suit and a narrow tie and sideburns and all that stuff. That's the way it was. And I'm talking about some heavy stuff about the United Nations, more deadly than war, the communist blueprint for the takeover of America, things like that. And so that was the beginning. And I've just been building on that ever since. I opened up American Media Inc., which was a production company for these little videos. And it's been a kind of a 1 or 2 tank operation, but growing gradually. And then we got this idea that we're going to create the Red Pill Expo. And so that sort of in a nutshell is the whole thread. A lot I left out, but you get the idea. One little step leading to the next one, not really knowing where you're going to go, but being driven by this impulse to do the right thing and fight against this ignorance and this apathy and these lies and these deception. I just can't let it go. And so that puts me here today talking to you on this high-tech system. And I don't know what comes next.
I don't either, because you hit several of my questions, which I thought were pretty insightful and subtle, but you managed to cover most of them. So one of them that you didn't get, though, is what made you know that Pat was the right woman to be your wife, to be with the rest of your life? She was at Red Pill in Hartford, right? What made you? What was the deciding factor? How did, out of all the women in the world, and you must have, seen a few at that point, what made you know she was the one?
Oh, that's easy. She was the prettiest thing I ever saw. And it's that simple. I wish I could tell you that I studied her character and I looked at her family background and looked up the genetics and the family tree, and I thought she'd be a good mother. No, I'm a young guy, and I think here, wow, this is the beauty. This is the one that everybody's chasing after. This is the one for me, and I was lucky. I was lucky that this girl had all the characteristics. Now, maybe I tuned into that subconsciously. I don't know. But frankly, I don't think so. I think I was just lucky. And maybe the experiences that we went through together were partly responsible for bringing out those qualities in her, as well as they were bringing out qualities in me that I didn't have or didn't know that I had, at least in the beginning. But in all honesty, Richard, it was just, it's a guy-girl situation. I'm like, wow, here's the girl for me. And how many young men stop and think about, is this girl my intellectual partner or all of these things? No, it's, wow, my heart's beating and, hey, baby, what you doing Thursday night,
Well, you had invested in yourself enough to have the confidence to act on your observation. And if you got lucky, I teach the students that luck equals preparation plus opportunity.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
you had prepared yourself for many years. You had taken yourself seriously. You didn't have an easy childhood. You didn't use that upbringing as a victim mentality to be like, woe was me. You made yourself, you used and leveraged all those resources that you got access to all the way, and you didn't have things handed to you. So what you did was a result of hard work. But the part where everyone went record scratch was when you had a perfectly good paycheck, you got a wife and kids, and then you're like, I'm going over here now. This is where my passion is. This is where my heart is. This is where my soul is. And selling insurance and facilitating that process, though lucrative, is not meaningful or substantial or fulfilling. So that's a courageous jump you made.
Well, it was sort of a mad move. There's more to it than that. The Equitable at that time started sponsoring a television series on Roots, I think, Heredity, and I could see that program had an agenda. It had a twist to it. We still see that same agenda today. It was trying to present America in a very bad light because America inherited the tradition of slavery. The program was trying to make it seem like America had created it, and was enjoying it. And they didn't portray the truth that America was the boiling pot where they were trying to get rid of it. You just don't say, hey, we're rid of it. It takes a couple of generations to move out of that tradition of slavery, and it was imported into America. And anyway, I saw this propaganda in a TV series that was sponsored by the company I was working for. And I thought, this is it. How can I serve this master? And so that was the other part of it.
Well, I think the series was Roots, and it was based on a book by Alex Haley. So I'm not sure if a political slant came in the production of the TV presentation, or
I don't remember either. Yeah.
But at that time, that was in the 70s when that came out. Shortly before that, there was a lot of United States activity in Africa against indigenous populations, like what happened in the Congo. And there was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And I remember, didn't you do a black and white video back in that time frame about that situation?
I did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And did you travel to Africa for that?
No, I didn't. Actually, Richard, my first book was largely on that topic. It was on the United Nations, naturally. It was called The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the UN. And the first part of the book dealt with that tragic episode in Katanga and Moishambe, and how the United Nations went in there and literally killed off everybody that had any common sense, and at the force of arms implanted a communist dictatorship. It's just as clear as it can be. There was no misunderstanding that history at all.
And that happened around the same time where Quigley's publishing Tragedy and Hope, and in there it says that the group he's talking about often works with the capitalists and the communists, seemingly opposing sides, and that they're orchestrating. And what you just cited was one of those orchestrations in Central Africa, because they can just take out a regime and put another regime in there, or take out, in the case of like Iran, democratically elected Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, and they can put in their proxy for Western forces to rule over. Yes. So you were on to something pretty early. I don't remember seeing too many other people cover that topic from back then.
No, there weren't. And it was unpopular. That's so I got used to being unpopular very early on. When you come out against the UN in the this was 19, early 74, the book was published. So I was giving speeches on that probably about 1972. And it was hard. It was a hard sell. Even though I had all the documentation and all the evidence, people did not want to believe it and could not believe it.
Well, another thing that was going on in the 60s that people still, they wouldn't believe it today if you showed them the documents, but it was the United Nations agenda to disarm America. And that was part of an official, I think, a national security memorandum or a State Department memo that had to do with that. So what you were pointing at was being validated by documents at the time, but without media outlets to really circulate those things to a lot of people, it makes the struggle take a lot longer to get this information to a wider group. So how are you encouraged today with the internet and the fact that you don't have to mimeograph things, you don't have to put them on slide transparencies and VHS tapes? I mean, the potential for more people to realize much faster exists now. And so how does that make you feel?
Makes me feel very encouraged, and it's exciting to see that technology open up and allow us to get the information out so much further and faster than ever before. But by the same token, the totalitarians see that also, and of course they're feverishly working to clamp down on that. And we see it's happening before our very eyes. And in this time in which we live, they're clamping down on all sources of information. Probably I'll be declared as some kind of a internal domestic terrorist or something like that, or a racist. They'll invent something, and perhaps you too. But this is just, it comes with the game when we have to anticipate that. But so they're trying to clamp down on this wonderful magic box, the internet, and they think they can do it. And if we don't organize and push back really hard and fast, they may actually do that, so that people like us who have any kind of contrary message at all we won't exist as far as the world is concerned. They'll never know we exist.
And then things will really get out of balance because it's barely in balance with us existing.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think that people on a wider scale don't recognize what's going on or the types of things that have been talked about throughout your career is the dumbing down of the school system. The fact that the schools are not producing people who are capable of discerning fact from fiction or realizing when they're not being given facts and they're getting fiction. And you had once upon a time interviewed Norman Dodd. How did you come to know about Dodd to get him on tape? How did that all, production angle? Did you have to rent cameras? Give me some insight into how you made that famous interaction go down.
Well, I have to rewind that one too a little bit, but I came across Norman Dodd's testimony in a pamphlet, a document published, I think it was by the legislature of the state of Louisiana. Now, he testified before several state committees who were investigating, subversion in America. It wasn't just the House Committee on Un-American Activities or the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee at the federal level. The states, most of them had their own committees and doing a good job of gathering testimony from people who had been inside the belly of the beast and now were willing to talk about it. And I was devouring those publications whenever I could find them. And so I did find the testimony of Norman Dodd in one of those. I think it was Louisiana. It doesn't make any difference. So I read it, I marked it up, and I noted that when he signed in for a testimony, they asked him where he lived, and he didn't give the address, but he gave the town in which he lived. It was in Virginia. And it was, I don't know, I think it was a suburb of Alexandria, but I don't remember. I could look it up. It's not important. But I remembered, and that town, and I happened to be in that town with a camera crew. We were doing a documentary film. Don't ask me which one now. But I had a couple of guys with couple cameras and recorders. That in those days, it took a lot of gear. I mean, cables, and I mean, you drove around in a truck with all this stuff. And we had the weekend with no interviews. We had the weekend dead. There's nothing worse than having nothing to do in the weekend. So I thought maybe I can find Norman Dodd. So I called, and I was very lucky. I looked at the telephone directory, Norman Dodd. Hello. This happened to me twice, by the way, with another person I was looking at the same way. Just like, I can't believe it. There's a whole bunch of Norman Dodds there, and I just sort of pointed to one and called him, and that was the very Norman Dodd that I was looking for. So I asked him if I told him I read his testimony, and I was hoping he would be available to come and talk to us in front of our cameras. And he said, well, you saw him on camera. He's an elderly gentleman, but very serious. He said, well, Mr. Griffin, I would consider that to be very important to do. So that's how it happened. It just sort of fell across my path.
And as far as what happens after that, so you find out from Dodd in person that the congressional committee, it's worse than what's on the paper. There's a bigger thing going on here. There's the mixing of American culture with Soviet culture such that they can bring about something that can represent their form of globalism or collectivism. Did it become more pointed after sitting with him and him spelling it out in that great detail as he did?
Yes, that was really a profound interview, because it's what he was disclosing was profound. It was in an era in which people were concerned about communism by that name, as they should be, I think should have been. I was. But including myself, most of us were not yet aware of what communism really was. We thought, well, there's communism, and then there's socialism, and then there's fascism, and each one is different. I didn't realize then that they're all the same. So we were in a very precarious position where if we got sort of enthusiastic about fighting communism, and in the process we created something just like it under a different name because we didn't really understand its component parts, then this is a whole new level of understanding of the problem we face. And it was at that period of time that I began to analyze and strip apart these labels of communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, all that stuff, and discovered if you look underneath the labels, they all have a common denominator, and that's collectivism. And that's what Norman Dodd was talking about when he said that, the people at the tax-exempt foundations, the highest ones, the Ford Foundation, for example, the Carnegie International Foundation, or Foundation for International Peace, big money corporations. These are what people would normally think are the capitalists because they're wealthy. But when he talked to them, he found out, well, for example, Mr. Gaither, where the Ford Foundation told him, Mr. Dodd, what we're doing here at the foundation is to comfortably merge the United States with the Soviet Union. Now that's a mind bender, because if you're thinking of Gaither and these tax exempt foundations and these super wealthy people and dynasties as being capitalists and being opposed to communism, if they think somehow they're different, then this is a disconnect. But if you have the deeper understanding that whether you've got a lot of money or not is not the test, it's what you believe and how you get that money and how you use the money. It's not how much you have, because the communist dictators of the world have huge amounts of money at their disposal. They live in the palaces that the former emperors used to live in. The money is not in their name, but they have total access to it, which is the test of ownership. So it forced me at that time, and since then a lot of other people, to begin to think about this common denominator that's underneath the surface, whether they're wealthy people wearing striped suits and silk hats, or whether they're communist agitators out in the factories wearing soft caps and overalls, they can both believe essentially the same thing. And that's what Norman Dodd opened up. He opened up that area of exploration because he talked about how these super wealthy foundations were using their grant-making power to bring about a transformation, not only in America, but around the world, so that the world would be, in essence, what we had in the Soviet Union. And it's not communism, it's collectivism. Even Karl Marx made it very clear, and so did Lenin, made it very clear that when the Soviet Union was formed, that was not communism. They said that that's the Soviet Union of socialist republics. And in Karl Marx, he said, communism will not happen, comrades, until mankind is perfected. And he will no longer have desires to have a profit motive or to possess things. He'll lose that desire to be different and have individual advantage. Then, comrades, we can have communism. But until that day comes, he said, it is socialism. Well, people should read Marx so they understand that socialism is not communism. But the underlying thing is collectivism. I'm taking too long to answer your question, but all these thoughts are coming to mind. God was the crack that opened that up for me to see, and I'm happy to report that interview, which sat on my shelf for a long time because I didn't think anybody would be interested in it. It was too deep. They were all about communism, and I had it, and I tried to interest people in it. Oh no, I don't understand that, But 10 years later, I started getting calls from people saying, I hear you've got an interview with Norman Dodd. Do you still have it? I said, well, yeah, I think so. I dug in, I found it. So we produced it and made a DVD out of it. And it's been one of our most popular pieces ever since.
It's one of the must-see underground pieces of truth media that was produced. But in the 80s, definitely, that's like on the map for everybody. And the idea of the socialism and communism both being underlying of collectivism, socialism, in their own words, that's how they get to communism. But what people need to understand is on that road to perfection through socialism and then into communism, the leaders, the rulers, they never adhere to those belief systems. And this is shown even in dystopic fiction like Brave New World or 1984, where the people in the upper echelon, they have access to all these resources. It's only a management system for the worker class or the slave class that they install these, right? So,
yeah. Well, that's the essence of collectivism, that that somebody has to make the decisions on behalf of these ignorant masses because they're too damn stupid. So isn't it fortunate that there are people like us who have this view and we've been to school and we're wise and educated and we will make the decisions for you folks. And naturally, since we're making the decisions, we get the bigger piece of pie.
Now, after the Dodd interview, I believe it was when you interviewed Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB defector. There was a phrase that he used during his interview, and it was ideological subversion. I think that ties into what we were just talking about with Dodd. How did you come to interview a former KGB agent, and what did you think? Like, what was your feelings about that whole process?
Very similar to the Dodd experience. I came across Yuri Bezmenov's testimony someplace in one of these reports. So I just made it a point of contacting him and asking him if he would, sustain an interview with me. And he was first he was a little hesitant. He wanted to know who I was and all that sort of thing. But I guess I convinced him I was not setting him up because he was worried about his life. The KGB even then was tracking him in Canada, and they had somebody had taken a couple of shots at him a couple of times when he was in Canada. He was working for the American Broadcasting, what do they call it? Freedom. It was a propaganda station that the Americans put on and beamed it inside Eastern Europe.
Radio Free Europe?
That's it, Radio Free Europe, yeah. And so they had a transmitter in Canada too, and he was working there, speaking in Russian, and sending out messages to beaming them, trying to get them into Russia. So the KGB was after this guy, and they were, tracking him down, and they would have taken his life if they could have, because they don't. In those days, it wasn't just a question of getting rid of somebody who was a danger to them. but just for discipline purposes so that others wouldn't try to defect. If they let somebody get away with it, then there'd be others who would defect. So they had to, make it clear that this is not a comfortable thing to do. So he was worried about being assassinated. So he wanted to know who I was, and I don't know. I guess I convinced him I was not a KGB agent.
Yeah, he continued to live after that day. He didn't die after the interview. And there was the one aspect was he kept describing things that were going on in Soviet Russia that he thought were not good. So he comes over here to Canada, America, and he's like, those things over there going on they're bad. But those things that he was describing in Soviet Union are now being kind of unveiled, unfurled in America and Canada. So how far, since since it's been decades since that interview has taken place, how far have we come toward actually being like the country he left in the first place?
Yeah, that's a subjective thing, I suppose. I know that when we did the interview, we dealt with that issue indirectly, and Bezmenov's appraisal then, whatever year that was, quite a few years ago, 80s, wasn't it? Anyway, at that time, I think he felt that it was already too late. And we didn't put a number on it, but I would have guessed, judging by his attitude, that he felt that we were past the halfway point to what it was like in the Soviet Union and moving rapidly. Because he was giving dire warnings. He was saying things like, if we don't turn this around quickly, it's going to be too late. And we did not turn it around. We just galloped right along that same line. So I don't know what Bezmenov would have said about today. I have a feeling he'd probably say, we have arrived.
I mean, I think it definitely taken hold through the education system. And he saw that if it got started and started indoctrinating kids generation by generation, that a couple generations into it, it'd be very hard to reverse that. However, he's going from his relationship growing up in Soviet Union and being in, Asia, Europe, most of his life. He didn't grow up in America. He didn't grow up with any type of freedom that people might adhere onto. So I see Americans are overly passive on some of these things, but they've been noticing, and more people are homeschooling. More and more people are becoming entrepreneurs and getting out of those lines of work where it's kind of soul sucking, meaningless, unsubstantial. So I do see, as they kind of ramp up New World Order world and globalism and collectivism, there's also a lot of people who are then taking the cue to step out and say, I don't like the beat of their drummer. They don't like what they're seeing, because freedom's being eroded, despotism's on the rise, tyranny's on the rise, reason's being rejected in favor of emotional rants, and meaning and substance are being also ejected from situations when they're most needed. So I see a collapse going on in the old infrastructure, but I also see a lot of encouraging, optimistic things going on with people who take it upon themselves to learn. And that helps their families, that helps their communities. And that's really like the individualist solution to the collectivist problem, that from how I've studied it, from years and years of your work, that's how it seemed to me.
Well, that's how I see it also, of course. Yeah, we come back to the recurring theme of this discussion is that we're struggling and swimming as hard as we can. We don't necessarily know where we're headed, but we do know we're headed in the right general direction. And the exact point where we'll end up, maybe we don't know. I really couldn't tell you how we're going to turn this around. I am totally confident that we can, if we keep moving in this general direction, where the awakening of large numbers of people as to what the problem really is. The problem is collectivism. And along with that, the sidekick to collectivism is the abandonment of personal individual responsibility, because we turn it all over to the state. We're not responsible. The state did this to us. We're a victim, as you like to describe it in that fashion so accurately. So very few people realize that they are ultimately responsible. And I think a lot of people are beginning to feel that Crusader gene start to vibrate, like mine started to vibrate in my mid-20s, before that, I never felt a single vibration from it. I was just climbing the ladder, trying to make some money, look good, have fun, like most people. But it wasn't until that first vibration, I didn't know what that was. I felt a responsibility to do something. And so I see this happening all around me. People who were along for the ride, maybe, and just enjoying life and kind of on the materialistic side, now are focusing as they mature, become better informed, and realize who they are, where they fit into the fabric of the world, why they're here. And they sense it, maybe not, you can't describe it, but you sense it, and they change. And I think that is the most encouraging thing that I have seen, is this groundswell of people growing up. They're becoming mature. They're becoming real men and women now. And they're not just whining little babies complaining about the world and how bad things were for them, and they never had a chance. And the deck is stacked against them, and why doesn't the government do this and all that stuff? I see that becoming marginalized. At the same time, though, I'm not stupid enough to not see the fact that these predators who are in control of the system right now at the top still have their hands on the levers of power. And that is a very dangerous situation, because, if necessary, they could start pulling some of those levers, and we'd be hard pressed to be doing what we're doing right now.
Yeah, and I think when you say collectivism's the problem, it's the problem because they're trying to eradicate freedom for almost everybody on this planet forever. And a very few people will sit behind the scenes of a technocracy that uses drones and robots and algorithms to manage a human population, and likely to cull them, if you believe their paperwork and the things that they've written. They don't need so many people around the planet anymore. They're not sure what to do with them, but they got a variety of options that they're testing and experimenting out there on live open populations, right? So there's a call to action going on. There is the opportunity to rise to this occasion, and you were born into a Great Depression era, and most people they got their gusto and moxie through World War II, which is an awful situation to have to be able to grow up, but it does force people to mature and act as if, and bring their life and reality on the line with freedom. And do you want to live as a free person, and you might have to have some responsibilities and make some strengths and strengthen yourself, or you can live as a slave and you can be, docile and comfortable. But there's a lot of other countries that have chosen that slavery for thousands of years. America didn't invent slavery. You're right. We inherited slavery in America. We also abolished it at one point. In the original Declaration of Independence and these sort of documents had anti-slavery ideas in there until they got edited out in later drafts. Yeah. So it's an evolution, but to believe for people to be told that slavery was invented in America somehow, that's not true, and it's not reflective of.
Oh, it's absurd. It's absurd. It's pure propaganda. And actually, if you look at the world today, I think there's more slavery in the world today than ever.
And it's sanctioned because
yeah.
Chinese communism enabled them to have a slave population where they also practice capitalism. So they have slave factories there. They have exorbitantly low labor rates, which draws American business over there, and American business can't compete because you're not using slaves over here. So the fact that we eradicated slavery in this country, there's slave markets that still go on in Africa, and there's slave labor that goes on in many, many countries. And people are all too proud to buy those devices and not give really any thought to the fact that they're supporting that system in an ignorant way. They're not using any of that technology to liberate those people or to embolden freedom. So they're assisting the slave masters.
Yeah. So slavery is still with us, unfortunately. And I think that, anyway, we know that it's a propaganda weapon. This whole thing about, racism in America, it exists, but it's so small compared to just about any other factor you care to measure. It's theater. I mean, they play it up. There are some actors on this theater that are really, really bad people, and they do bad things, and they do bad things deliberately to cause members of one race or another to react in revenge. They seek out to set fires in the minds. They create hatred and animosity because they want civil war. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's because there are people creating it and doing their best to agitate and inflame the passions of people. I mean, if somebody comes into a black community and shoots up a bunch of little black kids, little cute little kids, what are the black people going to think, especially if they're white people? Oh, they're the damn white people, right? And the same thing other way around. If you get a group of 10 or 12 black hoodlums that go into a white community and shoot things up, what are the white people going to say? Hey, well, we got a race problem here. And nobody ever asks who paid those people, who supported those people, who trained those people, who protects those people, who keeps them from being arrested and so forth. Their mind aren't even open to the possibility that this is theater and that there are evil people trying to create hatred that doesn't already exist. This is the horror in my mind, because someday they could succeed. And there are people who don't realize that their emotions and their passions are being played upon by watching the news and the things that are happening. And someday, it's to be some people are going to say, this is enough. I can't take anymore. And we could have the semblance of real civil war. Now, that's what they want, because now they send in the martial law as a solution. They created the problem. Now the solution is martial law. And we say, oh, thank God we've got martial law. We got to put an end to all this violence. Thank God for our government for doing that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, martial law then never goes away. Can people see that? And the answer is no, because nobody's telling them. Nobody's explaining it to them. And if the first time they hear that, they'll say, oh, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. But if they will do what I did when I was a young fellow and start to investigate this evidence and track it down, they will find out that this is absolutely correct, what I've just said. What we have, the biggest problems in America and around the world are being deliberately created by a small group of people who want violence and a breakdown of the old order so they can rebuild it to their heart's desire. And that rebuild will be international collectivism.
And they need your reactions to do it. They need people to react divisively in these topics and not step back and think and be like, wait a minute. The silver lining to everything you just said, which I think is very accurate, the silver lining would be that they have to spend time and money and energy making this hatred artificially, the divide and conquer. It's not there naturally. People won't naturally do that. They all want to get along and have a nice life. So the fact that they have to do these things artificially, I think states the obvious, that naturally we don't act like that. And what they're trying to do is unnatural. They have to artificially create these things. I think that says a lot about human beings, even in today's society where, it seems like there's a lot of violence and things like that going on. But there's, billions of people living on this planet, and most of us don't have any problem with anybody else. And we can all get along just fine, regardless of what color we were born into or where we were born on the planet, neither of which we can control.
Yeah, I think people, most people, even though they haven't thought it through in terms of actual words, they know in their hearts that it's not what's on the outside of the skin that's important. It's what's behind the skin. It's what's inside that counts. It's what thoughts and attitudes that people have, and what their belief systems are, how they treat you, what kind of people they are. Who cares what it is on the outside? It's on the inside that what counts.
I agree. I think that's beautiful. I think more people should think about that, consider it. Ed, I feel like I've monopolized your time. I know I have some students, especially Chris McMillan, who came prepared and had some questions that I read over him very shortly before this. They seem apropos. He seems to be getting pretty good at doing interviews. His first interview after learning how to do interviews on autonomy was James Corbett. So you're not his first, but these might be some of the better thought out questions he's had in the interview. And I said all that stuff to see if I gave him time to get off mute and see if he's ready to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. Now, if you need a break, water, there he is. There's Chris. I'm going to go on mute for a minute. That way you guys don't feel like I'm interrupting you, and I'll manage some of these other participants who have questions, and they'll be brought up in a couple minutes when it's done.
Thank you, Richard. Mr. Griffin, thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed that story. Thank you for sharing your life story. My first question was, it was going to be, what was your red pill moment? And I think you answered that with that pamphlet and then that visit to the library where you started to study the books on the United Nations. Was there anything else, would you say, that kind of spiraled you down the rabbit hole other than those key moments there in your life? And when about was that? What year are we talking about?
That pamphlet was probably 1950, because by 1962 I was in full gallop. Well, I thought I was anyway. I was just getting up to speed.
Very good. I wanted to ask you what some of your most challenging moments in your career as a researcher and journalist have been. And on the flip side, I'm going to throw a double whammy at you. What would you say have been some of the most victorious and rewarding moments in your career as a journalist and a researcher?
Okay, that's a good question. You make me think. Painful. Well, let's see. Some of the most challenging thing I had to learn in the beginning was to document everything I do that's the least bit controversial. I learned quickly that when you're taking a controversial position, you're going upstream, and most people just don't believe you and don't want to believe you. It's so easy for them to say, I don't believe that. And of course, even if you show them in black and white that it's true, even they still might say, I don't believe that. But it's harder for them to do that. And at least I realized early on, because I was in that mode where I would say things and I would be challenged. Well, you can't prove that. And in my mind, I would say, well, yes, I could if I had that document that I remember reading. But where's the document, So when I started to write my books, I knew from the get-go that I had to over-document just about everything. And I spent an inordinate amount of time running down little tiny details, finding a source for everything that I thought anyone might challenge. And it takes time to do that. And in some cases, you have to reject. You have to say, this is a great quote, this is a great fact, but I can't document it, so I can't use it. So you throw it away. That's hard to do because, darn, you know in your heart that it's right, but if you can't prove it, forget it, because it'll be a weak chink in your armor for somebody to say, yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's making these things up. And it says a whole series of things like that have been the challenge, because it slows you down. I probably could have written 4 or 5 times as much material if I didn't have to document it. But I'm glad I did, because of the documentation, I get very little feedback from people that want to challenge my accuracy or my academic status or something like that. I had one professor attack me on the internet and say that I didn't know what I was talking about and so forth. And so normally I let that go, but I thought in this case, I will just have some fun with it, because I knew that he didn't know what he was talking about. So I responded in form, and I said, well, thank you very much for that. I don't remember the details, but I just patiently and kindly and non-confrontationally answered his questions and showed where the information came from, and not only proved, but overproved that it was accurate and so forth. And then tried to do as gently as possible to show where his information was, in fact, not provable and where it was distorted. And after this exchange went on in the internet, I never heard from this guy again. He was after me quite a bit, but until, if I had not just taken, it took me at least a whole day to dig this stuff out and to answer him. I thought, nobody cares. This is just somebody on the internet, But those things will get to you, and it gets circulated. Griffin won't answer this. Griffin doesn't have the answer to that. Griffin is a fraud. He doesn't know, and so forth. So unfortunately, you have to do that. So I never heard from this guy again. That's probably, frankly, I enjoy the research. I enjoy digging into this stuff. So it's hard to say what's the most challenging part. It's just the time-consuming thing, I presume. But the most rewarding thing, and similar to that, I got to tell you about this. It was about 6 months after my book on the Federal Reserve was published, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And when I published that thing, I have to tell you, I was worried. That's the one, yeah. I was worried because, I don't have any background in money and banking. My training was in communications and not any serious topic like that. So I was probably the least qualified person in the world to take on the Federal Reserve System, for God's sake. But there I was, swimming around doing it. And I thought, when I publish this book, some professor is going to nail me to the wall and make me hang there for the rest of my life as being an idiot for having messed something up. So I was very, I say, worried about being exposed for the fraud I was by getting something or several things wrong in my book. So I was waiting for that to happen. So it was about 6 months after the book was published. I was on tour, and I was invited to a radio station on the East Coast in some town back there. I don't remember which one. So naturally, I was happy to accept it. And when I got there, walked into the studio, it was about 3 minutes before airtime, I was introduced to Professor so-and-so, who was sitting there also to be interviewed, and I was informed that we were going to have a debate. I thought, oh, my death date has arrived. This is the time when I'm going to get nailed to the wall by a college professor who's spent his whole life studying money and banking and teaches it in school. So the on-the-air sign came on, and the interviewer asked me if I could sort of summarize my case. So start off with that. I said, okay, well, here it goes. So I gave my presentation. I gave, several of the basic facts, like the Federal Reserve creates money out of debt and that it causes inflation. And this is it's a hidden tax, and it's hard on the poor people and very good on the bankers and the politicians, but it causes inflation, is a detriment to society. And I did the whole thing. And I probably took about 3 or 4 minutes to cover it. So when I was all done, the interviewer turned to the professor. Well, Professor, what is your counter to that? So I'm waiting for it to happen. And there was a long pause, and this is what he said. He said, well, what he says is true. That's all I needed to hear. But he was going on. What he says is true, but we're living well, aren't we? That was my big moment, because I knew then if a college professor in money and banking couldn't find anything wrong with my thesis, except that we're living well in spite of it.
But who cares? All is well, right?
Yeah. And so I answered him and said, well, some of us are living well. I mean, you are living well, and I'm probably living pretty well. But what about all the huge numbers of people on fixed incomes and retired people who are being eaten alive by inflation? What about are they living so well, Professor? When we got into that. So even his answer was incorrect. We, if you mean we the people, are not living well because of it. We would be living a lot better without it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the two things that came to mind.
That's great. Thank you. I want to go back in time for a little bit, back to the Norman Dodd interview. When we met at Red Pill, we had a brief conversation about his researcher, Catherine Casey. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what happened to her and what happened to the documents that she uncovered while she was doing her research for Norman Dodd during that process.
Yeah, that's a common question. Catherine Casey, for the listeners that are not familiar with the Dodd story, she was the secretary that was assigned to the committee that Norman Dodd headed up. Norman Dodd, first of all, was the chairman of the investigative committee who was to look into the affairs of the tax-exempt foundations after World War II. People were greatly concerned about the fact that they were promoting communism openly. I didn't know that at the time, but I went back to see if I could confirm those claims. And sure enough, I found the newspaper articles, the front page of the Hearst newspapers in particular, William Randolph Hearst had a real campaign going against the tax-exempt foundations because they were distributing booklets written by Joseph Stalin, and which he was calling for the overthrow of America and the advancement of communism, and the tax-exempt foundations were paying for this and doing it. So I didn't realize that. It was sort of buried in history by the time I came along, and so this committee was formed to investigate these charges. And of course, right away there were hidden forces in Congress that started to try and bury or hamper the activity of the committee so they wouldn't get anywhere. And one of the things they did was to assign Catherine Casey to his staff. Catherine Casey was an opponent of the committee. She didn't think it was proper at all. Her attitude was, tax-exempt foundations do so much good. What could possibly be wrong? And she thought that this was just a red herring and a fishing committee to destroy somebody's, reputation and all of that stuff. She couldn't conceive that these claims would be true. So she was on the committee, and she was sort of hampering anything that went through his office. But when Norman Dodd was at the offices of Mr. Gaither, I believe it was, with the Ford Foundation, and started asking questions about what the foundation did, Mr. Gaither said, well, why don't you just, maybe it wasn't Gaither, maybe it was the other one. Anyway, one of these fellows said, Mr. Dodd, you have a lot of tedious questions. He said, I have a counter proposal. Why don't you send someone from your staff to our offices, and we'll bring out the minute books of all of our meetings, and we'll open them up, and your staff member can look and read all of our minutes from day one, and you'll see exactly what we're doing here. And Dodd said he thought this guy had gone out of his mind, because he said it was a new president, probably didn't know what was in those minutes. So he accepted, and Catherine Casey was assigned to the job. Well, to make a long story short, she plowed through these records, and she had a dictation machine, and she would dictate long passages that she was reading from the minutes into the dictaphone belts, magnetic belts. And she found out that what they were doing is exactly what I said before, which is they were trying to convert America at the ideological level so it could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. It was trying to change the American political, economic, and social and justice system so to be indistinguishable from communism. Collectivism, in other words. They were trying to get rid of all concepts of our free system and go into a collectivist slavery system. And that was all in the minutes. And as Norman Dodd tells the story, that it was too much for Catherine Casey to take. She almost lost her mind. She couldn't believe it. And so she resigned. She couldn't take it. She had to leave from the work. And so now that's what she found out. That's the story. And the question is, well, what happened to her dictaphone belts or her papers? And the answer is no one knows. I've tried for a long time to locate them. And I thought, first of all, they'd be in the National Archives. I've inquired. I've had people go there and look. Had 3 or 4 different attempts at it. There's apparently no record. If it had ever been there, it's been expunged. And then when I found out a few years ago that one of the universities in the South had inherited the papers of the Dodd Committee, all of them, and they were putting them into storage and trying to index them. I thought, aha, I bet they're in the Dodd Committee records. So I've been in correspondence with them, and they don't have any record of it either. So I think we just have to assume that they're gone. Could have been accidental, but probably somebody who doesn't want that information to be known went to some length to get rid of it. I don't really know. So there's the story. There's the story. I can't document it. All I have is Norman Dodd's testimony.
The most disgusting part about the disappearance of those minutes is the fact that it's so unsurprising. It's the same old broken record. Get rid of the evidence. What university was that?
I know you're going to ask me that. I don't really remember. I won't even guess. But I bet if you look it up on the internet, just the Norman Dodd, or rather the Dodd Committee Records Repository University, you'll find it.
And whatever happened to her then? Does anyone know? I mean, did she have family?
No.
What happened to her?
I've never been able to find out anything further about her. No, admittedly, I haven't spent a lot of time looking for her personally. It would be interesting.
I'm just thinking down the lines. Did she have children? Maybe
I
they
don't
know
know.
something. You know what I mean?
Yes, good. I like the way you think. Well, I never pursued that, and I don't know of anybody who has. But
Well,
interesting.
well, maybe somebody listening tonight might take that baton and go with it, because
Yeah, I
there
hope
are a
so.
lot of good researchers here tonight in autonomy, listening to us talk. Mr. Griffin, this is my last question. What's happening nowadays with Red Pill University, and how do you see autonomy fitting into that?
Oh, well, Red Pill University is a house of fire. It's really, when I say a fire, I don't mean it's burning down. I mean it's hot, it's growing, and I'm so excited to be able to play a role in assembling and putting it together. We're just started. We're building the archives, as you know, and it should be stated for the record in this interview here that this will be the first official classroom downloaded into the Red Pill University as a classroom. And I think it's kind of the long form. Admittedly, maybe people aren't ready for these long form programs, but I am. I think anybody, a serious student, wants as much as they can get, as long as it's meaningful. And I think we've covered some meaningful stuff here, except from my childhood. I mean, that's nonsense. But I mean, when it comes to the historical facts, this university is going to be the place to go. It's all going to be there. So the fact that this is going to be the first official classroom, it makes it kind of a historic event. I'm glad to be part of it. In fact, that's the reason I wanted to be part of it.
We really appreciate you coming. It is very exciting to get it all going and to coordinate our efforts, because there's a war out against us, and we need to put all of our resources together to get through to people who are unaware of these important issues. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Griffin. I don't have any more questions for you at the moment.
Well, that's good. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed answering your questions. And Richard, you've got a great crew here. I hope if everybody has good questions like that, why, we're going to win this war.
I think there's a few more. If you can handle a few more questions, they're not as numerous, but there's individuals who have individual questions, if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. That's why we're here.
Tony, I saw Pam had her hand up. Could you patch her in? And if that takes a minute, I can read. There was a quick typed question from Colin Dixon, who's a student. He's a graduate who is Autonomy Season 1 from Australia. He was a school teacher for many, many years. Then he became a whistleblower. His question to you is, when did you learn how to read? At what age?
I don't remember. That's the honest answer, but I'm going to guess that I learned to read probably when I started. Well, it must have been before I went to the pasteur school that I was telling you about, because I was reading then. So I don't know how I learned to read, because I didn't go to the school very often prior to that. But I'm going to guess I probably started to learn at about maybe 6, and probably by the age of 9, I was doing pretty good, or 8, something like that. I don't really remember. I can say this, that I was not an avid reader at all until I discovered that I needed to read these books to get the truth. And when I had a reason to read them, it suddenly changed everything. It wasn't just to memorize something so I could pass a silly exam. And also I started to read different kinds of history books than the ones that we had in school. I'm struggling to recall the name of the author, and it won't mean much unless I do give you the name of the author. But anyway, there was a series of a couple of books written by this fellow, maybe I'll think of it, who wrote history from the perspective of the people who lived it. He was not like an external voice speaking about this is what happened. He drew primarily from the written records of the people themselves who lived through those events. And so I'm going to say that probably half of his history books were the words of the people, historical figures themselves. And boy, that changes everything. when you read and you can feel the emotions and the attitudes and the biases and the angers and the love and all those things and the amazement from the people themselves. And I thought, boy, I didn't know history was like this. It came alive, in other words. And since that time, I'm drawing a blank on his name. I'll call in later and you can add it to my underneath this, if you will.
What era was it?
Oh, the guy was an author. Oh, modern era. He lived in Beverly Hills. It's right on the tip of my tongue. And he's a contemporary. He's probably older than I am now, but anyway, he's a contemporary. He was writing probably in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but he was a great researcher, and he loved to get hold of original documents. And he wrote, I remember the first book I read by him was The History of Tamerlane. I think the book was Tamerlane the Great. Somebody wants to look that up, see who the author was. Tamerlane is of course, the Mughal conqueror. Everybody thinks of Genghis Khan, but Tamerlane was of equal stature and one of the greatest military strategists of all time. And they say that the game of chess was really invented following military moves and maneuvers of Tamerlane. Tamerlane was Timur the Great. In other words, the definition, Timur meant the lame. He was a warrior who was a sort of a sickly little guy, had a lame, dragging foot. But when he got to be general, he was one of the greatest generals of all time. And when I read the story of Tamerlane and some of the military strategies, for example, I'll just give an example. Now, this is a history book talking about one of the military ploys that Tamerlane invented was when you are confronted by a force of greater numbers, you have your choice of either running away or outmaneuvering him. And Tamerlane's choice was, depending on the terrain, you make your decision depending on the terrain. Now, if the terrain is just flat, you better run away because there's no way you can outmaneuver him. But if you are in terrain which has brush or trees or hills on the sides, then you can outmaneuver him. And he said, this is how he did it. Typically, just as the sun was setting, he would deploy all of the camp followers and all the women and the oxen and all the wagons and all the children to leave the area, as he called it, the indefensible area, to leave it as the sun was setting and to be in retreat. And they would drag behind them branches from trees. So a lot of dust would be kicked up. So from a distance, the enemy could see, the cowards are retreating. The whole army is retreating. Look at all the dust. Thousands of soldiers are leaving. But all they were doing was getting rid of the camp followers and the wagons and the horses and some of the oxen. The real warriors went to the sides and hid themselves in the bush and the rocks and waited there. The idea to do this at sunset was because they never fought at night. They always waited until the sun rose in the morning, and then the battles would begin. So during the night, the enemy would lay the strategy that, okay, the cowardly enemy retreated. We saw him retreat. Now in the morning, we will be after them, and we can catch up to them, and we will destroy them. We will slaughter them. And so that's what the enemy thinks. So when the sun comes up, they come galloping right into the former area of indefensible position. And when they get there, of course, they're attacked from both sides and they're destroyed. I remember reading that, and the way Tamerlane described it as something I'll never forget. And when you see history written from the words of people like Tamerlane describing why he was doing this and how wonderful it was to hear the cries of your crippled enemy and the moaning of his women, and how much of a thrill that was. And you think, oh my gosh, why didn't they write history like that? I've taken too long again to answer your question, but if history books really if they really told history instead of just facts, if they told the stories and the human drama, I think more kids would want to read history. I certainly would have.
That was a really cool answer to a question where you were like, if I don't remember the author's name, it's not going to mean a whole lot.
Bad start, right? Let's see. Oh, and the other one was Theodora and the Emperor. Theodora, the Empress of the last ruler of Rome. She was a whore taken from the pits and where they had all the gladiator warriors, and Theodora was taken in, and she became the Empress of Rome, while her husband degenerated in drunken debauchery, and finally all of the second lieutenants and all the people, the administrators of Rome, they stopped going to Justin. They started going to Theodora, and she became the last empress, and she was the last ruler of Rome. I didn't know that story, and this fellow told that story. Let's see. I'm going to go online and see if I can find the author. Let's see. This would be a shame not to do that.
It wasn't Howard Zinn, was it?
No.
All right, because that was offered as two people guessed that instead of looking it up. No,
let's see. Theodora.
All right, so I can I'll cut the search out of the final production, so we don't have that. And I was just looking at all these other questions that I don't think we have time for all these, but these are good questions. You're going to have to come back, Ed, for some of these. Some of these I know you could talk about for quite some time.
Yeah. Oh, darn. Maybe if I put the word book in front of it, that'll help. Harold Lamb. It just came to me, and I didn't find it, but it's his name, Harold Lamb.
See, you had it within you?
It was within me, yeah.
You just needed to try, and then your brain's like, all right, this is faster. I'll just give it to you.
You've got to read Harold Lamb if you want to read some real history. So that changed my whole attitude toward reading. Now I can, I'm a book junkie now.
That's great. I, too, didn't really appreciate reading. I mean, I did it in school. I did it through college. I read not for entertainment, but I wasn't really reading anything meaningful. So I'd read magazines and stuff like that when I worked in corporate world. I wasn't really reading books to feed my brain.
Yeah.
Once I figured out the world was not as it was presented to me on the map that was instilled through 15,000 hours of schooling, once I realized that I'm out there taking actions in the world and I don't really know how this all works. And I had several instances building up to, you need to take some time, get the right books, figure out what's going on. Surely other people have noticed this, mapped it out, left some trail. And then I started to really have a passion for reading, and it was feeding my mind. So the act of reading was feeding my mind. That's where the passion was, to feed my brain the things it needed to understand, to make the connections. Reading was the vehicle to do that. And also video and also audio. And there's a whole bunch of different mixed media formats. But to internalize, to keep feeding your brain so you can make these connections to actually understand, and eventually to be able to articulate them to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's everything.
I have another question here. Let's see. Okay. This is one. It could be a long answer or a short answer. This is from Daniel McCarthy. He says, is he aware of any connection between the Bavarian Illuminati and French and or American revolutionaries?
Well, yeah, there were some connections through the Masonic lodges. Now, I'm not really a scholar on that. I've got some good books in my library that I go running to every time I need a fact, but I do remember the general lattice of the story. The Illuminati, of course, became intertwined with the Masonic orders. There's some debate as to whether, which one came first, which one was the tail and which one was the dog. I don't know how to answer that one. I do know that there was a lot of overlap. And the Masonic order was very strong in the American colonies. In fact, it's an interesting fact. I think that the Boston Tea Party was made up, all of those guys were all Masons. If it hadn't been for the Masonic Lodge in Boston, there would have been no Boston Tea Party. George Washington, of course, was a Mason. I think everybody knows that. In fact, I found a letter written by Washington to some of his friends warning them about the negative effects of some of the European lodges, the effects that they were having on, or trying to have on, the American lodges. So Washington was concerned about the fact that there were elements within the Masonic movement that were not what he favored. So you get into that conflict about, who was fooling whom. And my general feeling is that the most of the lodges at that period of time were made up of men like the Boston Tea Party guys and like George Washington, who genuinely were trying to create a movement to overcome the what shall we call it? The existing order of government, the emperors, the elites, the ruling class, the royalty. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And so a lot of the Masonic lodges in the beginning were sort of conspiratorial, no question about it. They were trying to build a movement that would replace royalty with a more what we might call a democratic process. I hate that word, but that at the same time, there were other forces working alongside them that had something else in mind. They wanted to just use the secret society to literally take over the world, and to heck with freedom and liberty and human dignity. So I see that almost from the very beginning, these secret societies, especially the Masonic lodges, there had been a war going on within their ranks between these two groups. I would not venture to say which one is dominant today, if either one. But to answer the question with a short answer is yes, I am aware that there was a connection in those days, and I think there still is. But what we do with that information and what conclusions we draw is something else again. In general, I don't think that secret societies are a good thing, because the only purpose in having a secret society is to keep a secret. And what secret would we want to keep in terms of a plan for, changing the world, changing the society, changing the relationships of human beings? Why would we want to keep anything like that a secret unless there was something we would be ashamed of? So that's the reason I'm a little bit uneasy about any secret society. I remember in the beginning I considered maybe we should form a secret society. The only way to fight fire is to fight fire with fire. And the more I thought it through, I thought, no, secret societies always go south, and I don't want to be part of that. Does that answer your question?
I think that's going to answer Daniel's question just fine. And I've got a couple references that I can drop in that notion. Carroll Quigley's only problem with the Anglo-American establishment was he said, he's like, I've been a part of it. I know these people, and I agree with most of its aims. My major complaint is that they desire to keep it secret, and I think that people should have the opportunity to know about this stuff, right? So maybe was his caveat, so he could stay alive a few more years. Now, for the references, the George Washington letters about the Illuminati, it's a little confusing. They're in the Library of Congress, and they're letters between George Washington and a reverend named George Washington Snyder, 1792. There's a couple different ones. And I do have copies of the artifacts in question. The most credible book on that topic, Daniel, would be Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith by James H. Billington, who was a librarian of Congress and a Rhodes Scholar. There's been 2 Rhodes Scholars and a Skull and Bones guy that ran Library of Congress. And then, what was the other one? Oh, the other good resource on the Illuminati is Letters to Philo. And it's the second in command of the Illuminati, his letters with Weishaupt. So those actually exist. And then there was the the Illuminati courier Xavier Zwack, I think was his name, who got hit by lightning, and he had documents, and the Bavarian government put those on public display. So there are artifacts, and then there's a whole paper trail from there. So start with the artifacts and see where you go. Excellent question, Daniel.
Yeah,
Good.
it is. Yeah.
Excellent answer, too. I like that answer.
And there's a lot of very scholarly work out there. I mean, if you really want to delve into it, that rabbit hole goes pretty deep.
Dan Etzel has a question. He says, how was his upbringing influential to his determination to pursue truth no matter what the cost? Because you have to admit, Ed, there's a lot of people who probably could have, should have, maybe would have done what you did, but they didn't make it through that courage step, right? They stayed with their scared instead of using scared or fear as the origin of courage. You eventually, it ignited, you said it, you got courage and you made some bold steps. So Dan's question is, how influential was your upbringing and the ups and downs of your upbringing, most likely, that brought that change about to manifest later?
Yeah, it certainly was ups and downs. As I said, my family was pretty broken. My father was a professional gambler. My grandfather was a professional gambler. In fact, a famous one. I'm named after George Edward Griffin, the first. So I'm the second, and he was a one-armed gambler who was very famous in the Klondike area, gold rush days. And I'm here to tell you he was not an honest gambler, because I found some paraphernalia in my grandmother's house that, for one thing, a little very finely precision card, a paper cutter that could only be used to trim playing cards, and you could adjust it so that you could shave one end off. So if you're dealing and you're doing this, you can catch the wide end and deal from the bottom or the middle of the deck, things like that. So that's my father's side of the family, and those first 9 years were chaos. So I can't look to that. I'd like to think that when I was raised by my aunt primarily, she was a very highly principled woman. And although I wasn't aware of it, I didn't consciously think about this is a highly principled woman. Looking back on it, I'm sure it had an impact on me. For example, I remember one statement that I remember her saying it several times, and she said this. She said, "I have the courage to fight, but I'm too cowardly to surrender." The first time I heard that as a kid, I didn't understand that. But as I grew older, and now especially, I really understand what she was talking about. So she was a woman of that kind of caliber, and I'm sure some of that rubbed off on me. And I think a lot of it was luck, because, kids have role models, and they pick up role models on the street or in a coffee shop or on television. And unfortunately, that's why our enemies have captured our motion picture and TV industry, entertainment industry, because they put up these weirdo creatures, and they know that those will become role models for the young people of America. Somewhere along the line, I must have had some good role models. I don't remember them except my aunt, but they were there, I'm sure. So it's probably a combination of having some genetic material in me, but a lot of good luck in having come in contact with really, really fine people.
It's important for young people to have role models, especially today. Recently in the news, there was Greta talking about climate change. So Tom Trial has this question. What does Edward think about the climate change fascists pushing their propaganda via Greta, the 16-year-old?
What do I think about that? I think it's pretty crappy. I don't like it. It's mild compared to some of the propaganda they put out every day. It's just now it's in our face. It's in the news today. Next week it'll be something else. And these people are very, very professional at what they do. Not only are they professional, and they know what they're doing. They've been to school. They study these things. They know how to manipulate public opinion, how to change attitudes, and they do it very, very well. And what more can I say except that we're up against professionals, and I it's just something I want to say on that. It's hard for some of us to say, how can people be like that? And how could they lie? And with a straight face. I can't remember this poor gal. She was a woman soldier over there in the Middle East, and they made her out like she was a heroine. She was supposed to be wounded, and she fought, and she survived, and she sort of dragged into it, and she kept saying, no, that's not true. And finally, she got through it, and she just backed away from it. Said, no, all of this is not true. I didn't do any of these things. So who are her handlers, Who does these things, and why? And I know the answer to why is because these people are warriors. We're maybe interested. We're academics, maybe. These people are warriors, and they know that they are at war with us. They must conquer us. And in war, and they mean it totally, they are at war. In a state of war, there is only one immoral act, and that's to lose. That's what drives these people. They will do anything, absolutely anything, including murder, mass murder, genocide. They will do all of those things to win and to come to power. So I don't know, that's a little side thought that came to mind when somebody said, what do you think about what's going on today? It's just part of the pattern that shows that we are at war, and there are thousands of people on the other side, shooting at us in ways that mentally and propaganda ways every day. And we have to be realistic, and we have to get it. Maybe not to adopt the war mentality, say that we can do anything except lose, because we don't have that. Really, we don't have that. I don't know what word to put to it. We don't have that room to work in. Most of us, myself included, I would rather win this war without lies. Now, there's one more thing. You'll stop asking me questions, because one thing leads to another. If you are fighting for your life, would you lie to save your life? Well, most people would say, yeah, I would lie to save my life. Are we fighting for our lives right now, or for freedom? Would you lie to save your freedom? Would you lie to protect your family? And most people would say, well, yeah, if it really came down to that, a little lie wouldn't hurt anything. Then you ramp it up. Well, would you injure somebody to protect your life or your liberty or your family? And you can go all the way up to, would you torture somebody if you knew that they held your child in a room someplace, and if you didn't get the truth out of them, they were going to kill your child or torture your child? Would you torture that person? So, see, these are the things that you get into. It's very uncomfortable reasoning when you come to the wall and you say, are we at war or not? Is this for real, or are we just kidding? Are we really willing and able to face the reality of the fact that we are in total war? And it's a hard one, and everybody has to come to those decisions themselves. I struggle with that myself, because I do not believe that in our movement we should tolerate any of the things I've just mentioned. It's just, we cannot do it. But if it came down to your life, we have to be, if we're willing to sacrifice our lives in order to win, that's the most precious thing we have. These are things to think about. There are no answers here. It's just questions. But when you start talking about these things, they really go deep, and sometimes you lose sleep thinking about it. That's it.
Well, I know that the other side is they're very fanatical, and the fact that the young woman that they presented in that video, she's very well polished. She's obviously come from, when you do the research, who are her parents, who's putting her on that stage, who filled her head with those ideas. She's probably going to be like the global union president in 30 years. So that was her coming out party, and it's going to stir a bunch of people up because she's using emotional rhetoric. If you read the first paragraphs of Bernays' propaganda or Lippmann's public opinion back in the 20s, that's textbook. What they just did is a textbook propaganda, PR, strategic communications move that's put together by people who can easily be named these days who have
Yeah.
really big budgets, and they've had an agenda. When Greta was talking about, oh, for the past 30 years and how we've all ruined the planet, the people that planned for her to be on that stage, they started this plan like 50 or 60 years ago, and they're on record talking about it well before any of these changes that you think are happenstance or coincidental. It's like they called for this is going to be the agenda, and then they found data to continually support their conclusion, which brings me to another recent story, which was WikiLeaks just leaked early drafts of some of these climate reports. I was going through them upstairs, and when you say they're very well organized and like pedantic about these things, they are. Like each line in the draft is it's like a legal document. It's literally a legal document the way it's structured. So these are interesting things to dip into while WikiLeaks is still purveying these types of documents. You know, it's better reading than the New York Times, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly no reason for anybody in our group to be bored. If you're wondering what to think about or what to look at or what to do, you're in the wrong group because we have our work cut out for us.
For sure. So in order to see that we can keep cutting out the work that's needing to be done, I have a couple questions to wrap up this long form session. They're kind of entrepreneurial questions. They would apply basically how this course can benefit you. And I think you might be pleasantly surprised with how some of this goes. So my first question is, how would you define the word entrepreneur?
Well, I'm pausing because my first impulse was to say, well, everybody knows what that means, but then how do you define it accurately? You have to be, because you only get one shot, right? You can't say, well, no, I take that back. An entrepreneur, let's see if I can do justice to it, is a person who, as an individual, takes the lead in creating a process that will be financially successful, profitable, let's put the word profitable to it, and will also generate positive product or service. That's my first try at it. I think the critical words there were, it's an individual doing this on his own or her own, and the positive goals are to be successful and to create a good result. Probably more to it. How would you define it? I want to hear this now.
One who takes risk.
Risks, yes.
Yeah. And as one who's taken risks in your business, what are some of those risks that were gut checking for you, for Pat, as you guys made these decisions together over decades? What were some of the ones where you're like, we don't really have the resources for this, but we're going to have to do it anyway? I know that's pretty much every step of your journey, but I'm sure there's a couple where you really didn't know how it was going to work out. And maybe you had to have that leap of faith within yourself to be like, well, I'm going to make it work out. Just like we started the call tonight.
Yeah. Well, obviously the milestones, the first one was where I voluntarily took the risk, not where I had to, but I voluntarily took the risk, is when I decided when I came out of Fort Leonard Wood, to go to Hollywood instead of go back to Detroit, where there was a job waiting for me. So I was going to Hollywood. I had no idea what was out there. It was very glamorous, big, and dangerous. So it was risk. But I didn't look at it as risk. I figured, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll do something, but I just don't know what. The next one, of course, is when I quit my job at the Equitable, the big insurance company. That was risky because I really didn't know how that was going to work out. And then I was working for a time for the John Birch Society. I was hired as a coordinator, an organizer and a coordinator. And when I quit that, not because of any discord or anything, but I decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to be on my own, produce my own stuff. That was a risk because I didn't know where I would get the money to produce these films. And worse than that is who would buy them. I didn't know how I would market them. But I knew I had to make them. So those were the risk points. And then I guess that's about it. But taking risk, of course, when you dedicate 7 years of your life to researching and writing a book that you're not sure anybody's going to read, that's kind of risky. You don't think of it that way because in your mind, you're just sure that it's going to be great, But you also, further back in your mind, you realize that, oh man, most books don't sell. So maybe I'll have wasted 7 years of my life. Things like that.
Well, in your case, you lucked out because it was an excellent book. It became your calling card, and it's on a lot of our shelves, at least one copy of it.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I lucked out. That's correct. Yeah.
All right.
I didn't realize that I was touching a topic that would actually have a lot of appeal. I didn't realize that as the economy started to get really tight, that people would start thinking about the banking system as possibly being involved.
Now, as you progressed, your projects got a little bit bigger. How did you evolve your funding tactics, techniques, or strategies to kind of continue growing and not stagnate?
Oh, that's easy. Just continue to parlay. You just keep pushing the edge until finally you say, "Oh, that didn't work," and then you have to retreat. I have to say, I didn't answer your question like you hoped, because you probably hoped that I would say, well, I worked out a strategy, I worked out a business plan, I thought all these things through, and I progressed the, various checkpoints and all of that. None of that. No, we're back to the original jump in and swim model. That's how I've always done it. And I don't recommend that, by the way, because it's much better if somebody is able to organize and anticipate some of the crossroads that lie ahead. Not that nobody can anticipate them all, but if you could just anticipate a couple of them, that would be helpful. So I do recommend planning as wherever possible. But I have to admit, most of my life, I've just sort of gone on a gut feeling and said, "Full charge ahead, damn the torpedoes."
That was the exact answer I was hoping to get, because communicating that a good plan later isn't as good as just some action right now. When you're trailblazing, when you're being a pioneer, you can't wait for all that. You just have to start doing it. And then sometimes people who follow behind you, they can follow, oh, you've blazed the trail. Look, here's the markings on a tree. Here's the literal trail. And it saves them time. They don't have to go around and get in those loops we get caught in as, breaking some new ground, charting some unmapped territory. Yeah, it's a different journey when you're doing that, because you're going through the brush and you're trying to navigate through canyons and up and over mountains. But when you found that trail and other people can find it easily, that's priceless. That's helping them get a better time out of their life.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to wander in the wilderness. Deal with the brambles.
And we have to be clear on this, that not all trailblazers are successful. I mean, some people, are they're raising the trail and they trip and fall off the cliff. And that's the end of it. So there is a risk in that. But I agree with you. That has to be on the table as a primary option to make progress.
Now, there's 168 hours in your week, just like everybody else's week. What are some things that you spend your time doing during the week that might not be the highest and best use of your time, but they're things that need to be getting done? This is where I'm kind of inquiring about where we can aid and abet your operation and help you get to where you're going faster.
That's a hard one, Richard. I don't know that there is any area outside that well, if I had some interns, if I had some people who would have some time that could help in some of our projects, because we're broke as church mice right at the present time, that would be helpful. But I know that's not a long-term solution. We have to be able to carry the load ourselves. But right now, we're doing a lot of it. For example, I've got a library here that with probably, 4,000 books or something, and this is not urgent, but before I go on to the next world, I'd like to have that index. And it's only about 1/3 index now. I've got the world's largest collection of audio recordings on topics like this in cardboard boxes on reel-to-reel tapes, mostly. I've listened to all of them at one time. Well, not all of them, because I did inherit some boxes from other people, but all of mine, but I'd have to listen to them again to refresh my memory to find out whether they're worth saving. Most of them aren't. Most of them are not. But 15% of them will be gold nuggets. Boy, I would love to have somebody just listen to those recordings and earmark them and rate them. And then we got to digitize them, and then we have to produce them and get them into the audio archives for the Red Pill University and things like that. Those kinds of things are probably not very profitable, I mean, for the time spent, because they're just like, reclaiming old records. And there's not a lot of public demand for that. You can't sell it in the corner drugstore in a bottle. But maybe that's not the best thing I could think of. I often think about, wouldn't it be nice if I had some interns to do that sort of thing? I do. I know exactly but the thing that would help us the most and help me the most is for everybody you can think of to come into Red Pill University and come in as a student and participate, and particularly to form local campuses, because this is not just a place to come and listen to or watch videos and read books and talk about things. We've got to have boots on the ground. We've got to create local organizations in every county of this country and around the world, where people can make things happen at a political and social level by being there eyeball to eyeball with other human beings. That's the beginning of all movements. We got to have boots on the ground. So, yeah, why didn't I think of that? That's what we really need. And you can do that from where you are. You don't have to come here and spend a year in my library. You can get out there where your neighbors are and your friends, your family, and get these darn campuses moving.
I think we found a couple of things that, first off, the archiving, yeah, it's not a direct revenue generator per se, but I always find that the things that are worth doing and have to be done, they're not always revenue producing. So in order for me to do these things, I do these other things over here. They produce revenue, then I get time, I produce those,
right,
and it all balances out. So I think that as we move forward and we have the opportunity to interact more often, my other question I was leading into is your website. You said at the beginning that you're in the midst of building it yourself. We could definitely help you with that, even if it's just helping you get a better grasp on the tools you're using, or to maybe use a slightly better tool that makes things easier, or any type of skill sharing.
Well, thank you for that. I should clarify that I'm not alone in this. I do have excellent technical advice and help when I need it. But if I went to that source every time I need it, it would be a full-time thing. I'd just be depending on them. So my modus operandi is, before I go to Alan, his name is Alan de Gouvier, he's a great technical guy, and he's always there to help me when I need it. I say, no, I'm not going to ask for help until I've tried everything I know how to do to solve this myself. If I fail and it looks like it's going to take me a year to figure it out, then I'll give Alan a call, and he can usually help me out quickly. And it's a slow way to learn, but it's a very effective way for me to learn. Because once I try this, try that, and try this, and then finally, oh, that's the answer from trial and error, I remember it. It's not going to go away. But if I just call somebody and say, what's the solution to this? And they give me the answer, the next week I'll call them again and say, how did that work again? So that's where I am right now. I do have good help, but that doesn't mean I'm not interested in any additional help, because I may have something that I put up and say, who's got the solution on this? And that would be great.
Yeah, I don't want to muck with your already very well refined sense of how to learn new things, because you're right, you are building new neurons, and that's why your mind still works very well right now, because you're actively using it every day. You're not running into these walls and saying, oh, this newfangled technology is beyond me. I know from working with you over the past 6 months that you kind of know how to use Zoom better than I do. You're like, go in there and click original audio. And so I'm always very impressed that you keep up with these sort of things, because I know, I'm challenged by some of the technology, and you got a couple decades of experience on me. So
well,
just
that
know
gives me an
that
advantage.
your process works, and I don't want to mess with it. And if you do get
Well,
stuck and you don't have answers, reach out, because then many hands make light work. It's a lot easier for
I
us to
appreciate that. Well,
dig and search.
yeah. Well, I would say right now we're looking for students. We're looking for teachers. We're looking at people like ourselves. There are a lot of people among our friends who are doing things that others would like to know about. And so we'll have classrooms, as I think everybody knows, lots of them. And my hope is that somewhere down the line, we'll have our classrooms rated by the students themselves. So it's not up to us to decide which ones will come to this top. It'll be whichever one is serving the greatest need and getting the greatest feedback, a 5-star rating or something like that. So, but we never know which one is going to rise to the top. So I say, come on, bring them on. Let's get into the swim. See who swims the fastest and the furthest.
I also wanted to thank you for offering us the first classroom in Red Pill University. I have some graduates that are getting excited about the types of content that they can start putting out there and providing value for your audience, our audience, anybody that's watching the production. That's very exciting. I also have some graduates that have developed their own courses that might be something that you would consider. Is there a process you have in place if somebody had an offering that they wanted to have in Red Pill University? Is there a protocol? Do they call your phone or email you? Or
yeah, it's very complicated. Just send me an email. And for now, we should have a form, right? We should have a list of things we're looking for, and but we haven't created one of those yet. Well, there's something you can help me with. If you were in my position and you were looking for teachers or faculty members, what kind of a list of requirements would you make? And it's probably anybody could come up with a good set of requirements in 15 minutes of thinking. It's we don't want to make it too stringent.
It could be a short survey that has, name, their website, contact information, why they think what they're teaching about emboldens individual freedom, because that's anti-collectivism. So as long as it starts there, they would be on.
Well,
the right
I would
field.
say,
What do you think?
I would say, broaden that a bit. Why they think it's important? Because there may be the focus point may not be something that directly affects freedom. It might be something else, but indirectly, you'll never achieve it without an environment of freedom. You see what I mean? It might be something very personal, like how do you get rid of anger? I don't know. That came to mind. It might be something, in that category, or how do you remain healthy in a toxic environment? Or I don't know. I would just say, why do you think it's important? And I think that we got it with that one.
Right. So we can come up with some questions and to put a form up. That's not that hard to do either. These things, once they're made known, they're a lot easier to get done because, like I said, when you have all these hats to wear as an entrepreneur, at any given time, especially when the entrepreneur is a producer, there's a lot of things that have to go on. And I know that you know that, but for everyone else, it's appreciated because oftentimes we get so busy, I don't even know how to structure the request for help sometimes. And then I just end up doing it myself because it's easier than figuring out. But once you have methods and practices in place and you've got some people that you're on the same page with, it all becomes a lot easier. And then that little bit of delegation gives you more time, energy, attention, focus to make those next breakthroughs on the real problems that only you're going to figure out in your business. So
it's definitely a work in progress. Just yesterday, I became familiar with WP Form, and it's a little program. It's not too expensive, and you can create some amazing forms with check marks and fields and automatic calendars and all kinds of things. So now we can look like we know what we're talking about, even if we don't. It'll appear that we do because we can use a very professional form to do it.
That's excellent. That's excellent. It's all these little steps that add up to making the transition. And I think that as people start to see content coming through Red Pill University, interest is going to go up, and then you're going to have that forum so you can get other people in there providing value for your audience. And then from there, it's very easy for it to ignite the potential, and you've already directed it toward where it needs to go. So it's just a matter of steps. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear you say that because I am too. And I'm really excited to see you and your team come on, because I can't think of a better first step than that, because this is sort of like it's a high mark to reach, you know. The bar is already pretty high and we just started. so I'm very happy.
Well, I appreciate you taking time. I know that we only had like an hour on the schedule, and you've been very generous with your time. And I hope you feel it was well invested and that you'll grace us with your presence again in the future.
I'd be happy to do that, Richard, and everybody else. Thank you for staying on. I see these names on screen. I don't know how many more are listening in, but I hope my stories have not been too boring and wasteful. I know some of them are kind of silly, but if you don't prepare, that's what comes up. You get asked the question, and silly as you are, you answer it. And so who knows what'll come out.
And just so you know, Ed, there's dozens and dozens of people who have hung out this far. So long form content, people like it. I was an early adopter of long form content simply because what I needed to communicate was too big to fit in these little time slots. And over time, people seem to have they grew into it. They grew into it. So continue to try it out.
Well, you know, I think
like
I think that some people grow into it and some don't. But fortunately, the ones we're looking for do. It's right. The old argument, well, what about books versus video? Now, we're, of course, focusing primarily on video, and for good reason. But I'm just going to bet that all of your people are book readers. Because book readers are the kind of people that want to really know everything. They want to dig in, and they want to go back and read that again, and they want to understand it. It's not just an experience. It's a change that happens. So I am all for videos. I'm all for short little sound clips to draw people at the big end of the funnel. But as they get closer and closer to the narrow end of the funnel back there for Freedom Force International, we've got book readers.
That's true. I would agree with you. I would agree with you on the book readers. And then from my reading books and making 20-hour-long podcasts, some of those book readers started to listen to a lot of audio. And then you have the evolution of it. Now they have the time and space and capacity to internalize a course like Autonomy. Now, while you're talking, I got this text from one of the students. Let me see if he wants to come up and speak, actually. He has developed a fantastic course called Test Drive Your Future, and it's aimed at high school kids, early college kids that are trying to make these decisions and navigate in life. So his name's Jim Hood. He lives in Hawaii. He was at Red Pill. You might have met him, Ed. I'm not sure. So let me see if I can pull him up here, if he's available, just so he can say hi. And then if you guys ever want to go with that conversation in the future. Look, he's not even in here. I think he might. Oh, there he is, James Hood. Boom. Allow to talk, promote to panel. Let's see if this magic works. Sorry that I have to look down at my tablet so much to do that, but
there he is. There's his name.
Hey, Jim, can you hear us? Let's see if I need to give him permission to unmute. Unmute. We'll see if we go in. Maybe he's got a noisy background. Jim, can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Would you like to start your video?
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
I just turned it on for you.
There we go.
Big brother.
Hey.
All right. Ed Griffin, Jim Hood. Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, Ed, good to meet you. I meant to introduce myself to you at Red Pill, but you were doing so many busy, important things that I just kind of stayed off to the side.
Well, I'm sorry it didn't happen, but good to see you now.
Oh, well, I'm thrilled to meet you. And when Rich had just said something earlier about, I am one of the people in Autonomy who had developed a course. I've developed a course called Test Drive Your Future, which is designed to help high school and college students and even people beyond that figure out who they are, what they want out of life, and how to go out and make it happen. And I've been working with Rich and Autonomy for the last several months to kind of get that from where it is now out into the world. That is an ongoing process. But yeah, it's something that I'm very passionate about, been working on for about 10 years. I see it as my calling and what I want to contribute to the world. And as soon as Rich had said something about, oh, well, there's some people in Autonomy who have created courses and da-da-da, you know, if there was any interest in making that part of Red Pill University, I would be honored. And any way that I could support, I'm right there.
Well, that's perfect, Jim. I like the title right away. It's catchy and it has substance to it. Who wouldn't like to test drive their future?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you put substance to it. So, yeah, bring it on. I think it'd be ideal for our purposes too.
Great. Yeah, there's about 50 lessons in the course right now. I'm working with Joshua Hale in Autonomy to help promote it on Facebook. We're going to set up several tiers of it. We've got just the online course, which is Teachable, just like Autonomy is. But I'm also going to have coaching components where people would be coaching with me live and doing Q&As. I've also got some other coaches who are professionals in human resources that would actually be able to help work with young people to learn how to write a resume, to how to write a cover letter, how to present themselves online, how to actually conduct themselves in a job interview or in a college interview, so they are ensured to put their best foot forward.
Well, I sense from the phrase test drive that it's more than just how to, but rather how to anticipate whether you'd like it or not.
Yes, yeah. The way the course is set up, it was originally a book that my wife and I published back in 2010. And the first part of the book is a journey of self-exploration, figuring out who you are, what your values, skills, interests, things like that. The second part of the course is actually having them dive in and do some research to figure out what's even available out in the world. How could they utilize these things that they're good at and things that they're interested in? As, especially young people might not even have any idea of what's available out there. And then the third part of the course is where the Test Drive Your Future title comes from, in that we ask young people to step out of their comfort zone and go out into the world and cure your complexity, that's what Rich says, by going out into the world and actually trying to find people who do what you think. You want to be a dentist? Great. Take a dentist out to coffee. Talk to him about what it's really like to be a dentist. You know, shadow him at the office. Maybe even see if you can get a part-time job or an internship. Figure out before you start this multi-year educational process if this is something that you really want to commit to, you're really wanting to spend the time and the money on.
Well, that's a fantastic concept. So obvious, but how come nobody thinks about doing that?
Yeah, that's just it. And I mean, it's the numbers are tragic, and I just see it all. I live in Hawaii, and I have parents who are spending $70,000 a year to send their children to me. I was just working with a client last week. She spent $70,000 a year to send her daughter to a mainland college in Colorado. She finished her bachelor's degree in sociology, which you can't get a job with. And now daughter is working at a makeup store with $200,000 in student loan debt. It's just, it's absolutely tragic.
Oh, case history. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, that's wonderful, Jim. I wish you the best of luck. And especially if you had some little tips on how you can do that.
Absolutely.
You know, maybe there are people who could help make the introductions. I don't know. That's up to you. But that would be great. I'd like to take that course and see where I'm headed. You know.
Well, I think you've got it pretty well dialed in at this point.
Yeah, but I might not like it. See, that's the thing.
Well, I've changed my mind. I'm giving up trying to educate the world about the fiat money system. I think I'm actually going to sell shoes, right?
Yeah, because I talked to 3 people that have been trying to save the world, and they're not very happy. So I shouldn't be.
Well, you chose a very tough. I mean, what I really wanted to say when I was at Red Pill is just thank you. I mean, I was introduced to your work through Rich a few years ago. I finally bought Creature from Jekyll Island last year on audio, and I listened to it 3 times back to back to back.
Oh, wow.
And it was like my mind just kept being blown over and over. And Rich had said something, well, I'm sure a few people on this call, I have multiple copies on my shelf back there because I bought a whole bunch from Amazon so I could give them to some of my more intelligent, thoughtful clients. So I'm like, here, read this giant book that's going to make you want to curl up into a ball and cry, so I can have somebody to talk to about it.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, Jim, you're on the right track. It's my pleasure to meet you, and I'm going to wish you good luck, but you don't need the luck. You're going to just make it happen. So,
well, thank you. I
fantastic.
appreciate that. And I'll reach out to you, and we'll continue the conversation, and I'll see if there's a way that I can be of assistance. Yeah,
maybe you'll be the second classroom to put up here.
It would be my honor.
And once we start and we show the quality and the substance of these classrooms, I think everybody and their uncle is going to want to be part of it. And then we'll have another problem, which is who do we reject? And that's where we come back to the question of we have to have some kind of a filtering process.
Absolutely. I sincerely hope that you have that problem.
I'm sure we will.
Got to get the word out there.
Yeah.
And feel free to feed Jim a failure if his course isn't up to your quality levels or your content levels. Feel free to tell him no. He could use a failure. It's going to help him learn.
Well, I've only been trying to get this off the ground for 10 years, so I've definitely had my share.
Well, that's an interesting point. This is probably not the place to go into that, but it impinges on the question of who decides.
Right.
And that's where the student rating has power. If Jim comes up with a failure, he's going to get a 1-star rating, and that'll take care of that. That particular class won't survive.
Yeah. Well, because I'm so passionate about it, I'm like, I want people to get into the course and tear it apart and tell me what's wrong and tell me what doesn't work so I can make it better, so I can make it work for me.
Of course, yeah.
That's ultimately what would serve me the best. So I offered it up to several people in Autonomy, and so far I've gotten nothing but good feedback. I'm like, come on!
Tear it up.
Good. Well, wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you, Ed. I'll be in touch.
All righty. Nice meeting you.
Good to meet you.
Ed, thank you so much for your investment of time today. It means a lot to those of us who are participating live. It also means a lot to the people listening to the replay. And most of all, it means a lot to the people who are watching it in Red Pill University.
Well, it's my pleasure, Rich, and thank you for inviting me. And I feel really good. We got a great thing going here, so let's get this ship sailing.
Excellent, outstanding. I'm looking forward to Red Pill coming up in November. That's the 8th and 9th?
8th and 9th, yeah.
Mesquite,
just for the record, the year is 2019.
2019.
Yeah.
And will it be is there a number for the Red Pill Expo? Is this the 4th? Because you have the interim ones. You have the big ones, and then you have the little ones.
Well, this is not going to be a little one. We've decided to scrap the little ones. We're going full bore. We're going to do 2 full bore Red Pills a year.
Outstanding. I look forward to being able to help you support that.
I think it's a good number. I wouldn't want to go any more than that, but one a year wasn't enough. It was we get all the momentum going, and people are saying, "Well, what do we do now?" And you can't wait a whole year. We got too much to do,
So now the recommended dosage for Red Pills is 2 per year.
2 per year. Yes.
That's a good dosage. Good dose of reality and time to work it out in between.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I like that analogy. 2 per year.
Excellent. All right. You have an outstanding evening. I'm sure you've got many phone calls to return. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you all. Thanks for inviting me. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Mm-hmm.